biography of missionary John Williams,
The Martyr Missionary of Polynesia.
This audiobook was produced by scrollreader.com. We have also reprinted this book for anyone interested in a physical copy. Preface by James J. Ellis. John Williams must ever occupy a prominent and unique position among missionary heroes. His remarkable mechanical genius, his romantic adventures, and above all, his tragic death, continue to invest his name with a peculiar charm. His place among the champions of the cross is distinctly his own, and in his particular form of service, he is certainly the equal of Carey or any of the mighty men of missionary renown. The chastened sweetness of his disposition, which never degenerated into weakness, his ingenuity in devising expedients, and his resolute persistence in what often seemed like labour in vain, combined with a large-heartedness that could not be confined within the limits of a single reef, make him, in the writer's judgment, the very prince of missionaries since the days of the Apostle of the Gentiles. An attentive study of his private journals has deepened the writer's reverence for the hero of his youth, and he now finds himself uncertain whether to admire more the greatness or the persistent goodness of the Apostle of Polynesia. In these times, when missionary operations are keenly scrutinized, and not always, it must be confessed, in the most friendly spirit, it is inspiring to observe in John Williams the heights to which Christian magnanimity and consecration have risen. While we are thankful that such a man has lived to reveal to us the possibilities of life, his career is surely also a promise of future missionary heroes, and perhaps, alas, martyrs yet to come. To accurately assess his character and work, we must consider the conditions under which he laboured. First, he was not inspired and encouraged by great enthusiasm from home, such as motivates present workers in the Congo, for example. In his day, missionary societies were feeble and extremely cautious. They moved tentatively, clinging closely to familiar shores and nervously fearful of venturing too far into unknown waters. They were horrified when this bold pioneer sailed into what they perceived as hazardous experiments, yet he neither suffered shipwreck nor loss. The wreckage he encountered revealed the unknown continent he sought, and he pressed on until he discovered it. To him, therefore, belongs much of the anticipatory wisdom that later became common knowledge, and he set the standard by which subsequent labourers have strived. It should not be forgotten that, for much of his lifetime, he laboured in relative obscurity. It was only after his visit to England that he was fully recognised as one of the master spirits that Christ occasionally gives to his church. Thus, his success was not the result of widespread approval, as success sometimes is, without reproach, but was solely the product of the principles that guided him wherever he was placed and in whatever task he undertook. Whether building a ship or translating the scriptures, he remained the same simple, earnest, and affectionate disciple of Jesus and brother to all men. Given his character, success was natural. Failure would have been a greater wonder than even his remarkable triumphs. The sources for this narrative are, first, William's own matchless missionary enterprises in the South Seas, a book as refreshing as it is interesting, imbued with the writer's gracious spirit, Prout's valuable biography, now out of print, The Missionary's Farewell, The Martyr of Erromanga, Euthanasia, The Chronicles and History of the London Missionary Society, along with the original journals of Messrs. Williams and Cunningham, and the account of an anonymous writer on board the Camden at the time of the massacre. The author gratefully acknowledges his debt to his friend, the Reverend Samuel Tamatoa Williams, who not only provided valuable information, but also kindly corrected the narrative, to William Williams, who made available all the letters and journals of his lamented father, and to numerous other friends who have rendered valuable assistance. It is believed that some incidents in the present volume are now published for the first time. Chapter 1. A Word with Many Echoes. A young man stood near a street corner on the City Road in London. The light from the lamps fell upon his somewhat large features and tall form. Though only 18 years of age, his frame promised great physical strength. It was Sunday evening, January 3rd, 1814, and the bells were chiming for service. It was Sunday evening, January 3rd, 1814, and the bells were chiming for service. Although he was accustomed to attending divine worship, he paid no heed, as he was waiting for companions with whom he intended to visit the Highbury Tea Gardens in North London. That young man's name was John Williams. Following Ruskin's principle, "Tell me what you like, and I will tell you what you are," John Williams' enjoyment of such pleasures as a tavern garden revealed how far this son of a Christian mother had fallen. He later reflected on this period of his life, saying,
"My course, though not outwardly immoral, was very wicked. I was careless of the holy Sabbath, a lover of pleasure more than a lover of God. I often scoffed at the name of Christ and his religion, and totally neglected those things which alone can provide solid consolation."
As he lingered, impatiently waiting for his friends, who providentially were late, a lady passed by. She immediately recognized the young man as one of her husband's apprentices. Moved by an irresistible impulse, which later events proved to be a prompting from God, she spoke to him. He shared his disappointment, and Mrs. Tonkin, for that was the lady's name, invited him to accompany her to the old Whitfield Tabernacle, located near the City Road. He refused, but she persisted in her request. At last, weary of her persistence, and a little annoyed by his companion's tardiness, he relented and entered the chapel. This moment marked the turning point in his life. In Carlyle's words, he was
henceforth a Christian man, believed in God not on Sundays only, but on all days, in all places, and in all cases.
24 years after that fateful evening, as John Williams prepared for his second voyage to the South Seas, he addressed a crowded assembly at the Whitfield Tabernacle, since demolished, and recalled his conversion.
"I have the door in my view at this moment, the very door through which I entered. The circumstances of that important era in my history are vividly impressed on my mind, and I can still picture the exact spot where I sat. I also distinctly remember the powerful sermon preached that evening by the excellent Mr. East, now of Birmingham. His text was one of the most striking portions of Scripture. 'What is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?' In his gracious providence, God so powerfully influenced my mind that I forsook all my worldly companions and became a teacher in the Sabbath school connected with this place. Many a Sabbath after that, I sat on the form now before me with my class, share in the knowledge that God, in his goodness, had given to me."
He rightly remarked,
"Little did that female friend, who took me by the hand and brought me to this place of worship, imagine the outcome of her kind effort. Oh, friends, what momentous consequences in the providence of God are poised upon seemingly insignificant incidents. It shows what may be done for God by those who seem insignificant, people of no great note in the Christian church."
John Foster once said, "At the age of 22, I feel I have still to begin to live." A similar realization struck John Williams on Sunday evening, January 3rd, 1814. But unlike Foster, Williams didn't just recognize this truth. He embraced it fully. From that moment on, he truly began to live, for he now lived by faith in the Son of God. On Sunday evening, January 3rd, 1814, John Williams made the same discovery. It was then that he truly began to live. For from that moment onward, he lived by faith in the Son of God. Before we continue with his later life, however, we must go back and look at an earlier chapter. During the reign of James I, two yeomen knelt by the roadside near Witney, Oxfordshire. John and James Williams were brothers who had been expelled from the Bishop of Bangor's diocese for their nonconformity. At that time, there were no Bibles in Wales except those in churches, and many parishes were served by clergy who did not speak Welsh. The Bishop of Bangor recorded in his journal that, during a visitation of his diocese, he found that in some parishes there had been no preaching for 5 or 6 years, and in others, the graveyards were being used as stackyards, with the vicar's saddles and beehives stored inside the church. Yet, because the Williams brothers absented themselves from services they could not understand, conducted in a language foreign to them, and often by clergymen like Sir John Edwards, who spent most of his time in public houses, they were banished from Wales. The 2 exiles were Baptists and joined a church of that persuasion in Langworth, Berkshire, but they were not allowed to remain long there, and so they wandered until they found themselves near Witney. Hungry, poor, and friendless, they did not know where to go for shelter. Kneeling by the roadside, they prayed for guidance and help. According to the custom of the time, they asked for a sign from God to indicate their next steps. Rising from prayer, they tossed a straw into the air and followed the direction it fell. By nightfall, they reached the village of Cote, where they asked a farmer for permission to sleep in his barn. The farmer agreed, and the next morning, impressed by their appearance, he questioned them and heard their story. He then offered them employment, which they accepted, and they entered his service. James Williams later married the farmer's daughter, while his brother remained unmarried. The brothers appear to have prospered in Cote, as there is a record of their purchasing land there. However, they remained steadfast in the faith for which they had once lost everything, and they built a Baptist chapel in the village, which is still in use for divine worship. One of James Williams's descendants became one of Cromwell's Ironsides, known as Black Williams, and he retired to Cote at the Restoration. A much later descendant of James Williams moved to Oxford, and his son Richard became the father of the future missionary, John Williams. John Williams' mother was Miss Maidment, whose father resided above his china and glass business in St. Paul's Churchyard. The firm, known as Maidment and Neal, later relocated to Cannon Street. As a young woman, Miss Maidment attended the ministry of the famous Romain, author of The Life, Walk, and Triumph of Faith, who was so popular that people were said to come from the country to see Garrick act and to hear Romain preach. Mr. Maidment was a close friend of Romain, and for a time, Romain conducted weekly services at the Maidment home in St. Paul's Churchyard. After her marriage and subsequent move to her husband's home in Oxford, Mrs. Williams worshipped with the Baptists, where the Reverend John Hinton was minister. Later, Mrs. Williams and her husband relocated to Tottenham, a small village 6 miles north of London, where they lived for several years. It was in a little house on the brow of the hill, just beyond the green, and between the current site of the Congregational Chapel and the High Cross, that their son, John, the future apostle of Polynesia, was born on June 27th, 1796. No anecdotes of his boyhood have been preserved, but it is known that John was cheerful, active, and intensely affectionate, showing early signs of his remarkable mechanical genius. Perhaps the most notable feature of his youth was his ability to win people over, a trait later remarked upon by his fellow missionary Mr. Pitman.
Williams was possessed of a peculiar talent which at once won over the natives, whether chiefs or common people.
As a boy, he similarly won over his acquaintances and friends. His mother attended the old independent chapel at Edmonton, nearly 2 miles from their home, and John regularly accompanied her, occupying a pew in the right-hand corner of the gallery facing the pulpit. For schooling, he went even farther to Lower Edmonton, nearly 3 miles from Tottenham High Cross, where he was taught only writing and arithmetic. His mother was likely his primary educator, and certainly his best, as she gathered her children daily to instruct and pray with them. When John reached the age to begin his working life, he was apprenticed for 7 years to Mr. Tonkin, a furnishing ironmonger with a shop on City Road. His apprenticeship contract, dated March 27th, 1810, stated that he was not required to perform the heavy labour of the trade, but was to focus on learning the retail side of the business to prepare him to manage a shop of his own in the future. Around this time, his parents moved from Tottenham to a house in Spencer Street, Goswell Road, London, likely to be near their son.
Every man's best education is that which he gives himself,
remarked Wilberforce, and this certainly proved true in John Williams's case. Although he was not meant to be a mechanic, after mastering all that was required of him, John Williams took every opportunity to acquire practical knowledge of the trade. In his spare time, he visited workshops, closely observing the workmen, and when they were absent, he conducted his own experiments in metalworking. Before long, this almost self-taught mechanic became so proficient that any task requiring special skill was entrusted to him. It was said that he took such pleasure in his work that he would eagerly shoulder the necessary tools and hurry to any job, just like an ordinary mechanic. However, while honing the skill, one that would prove invaluable later, he did not neglect his primary duties. In fact, he became so capable in managing the shop that, for a considerable period, the entire business was entrusted to him. This brings us to the Sunday evening that marked the turning point in his life. An earnest clergyman from Yorkshire, during the Great Revival under Whitfield and Wesley, used to say, "I do love those one-eyed Christians." John Williams became such a one-eyed Christian, fully and decisively breaking from the world and dedicating himself to Christian service. In September 1814, he became a member of the Tabernacle Church and immediately began to work as a Sunday school teacher, tract distributor, and visitor of the sick. His efforts were fruitful, and at least one soul was converted through his early ministry. Aware of his own shortcomings, a humility often gained in the course of doing good, he joined a mutual improvement society that met every Monday evening to discuss important topics. During this time, a class led by the eccentric Reverend Matthew Wilkes proved particularly beneficial to him. This class was composed of young men preparing for Christian ministry, and Wilkes, a keen judge of character, invited John to join. Matthew Wilkes was also a passionate advocate for missions, and once a quarter he held missionary meetings in the Tabernacle to spread information about mission work. At one such meeting, in the autumn of 1815, Mr. Wilkes announced the conversion of Pomaré, king of Tahiti, and many of his subjects to Christianity. After years of waiting, the natives had become Bure Atua, or praying people, creating a significant need for additional missionaries. As Mr. Wilkes shared these good tidings and the urgent need for workers, John Williams felt a quiet stirring in his heart. At first, the desire to serve as a missionary was hidden, nurtured only as a distant possibility. But as the desire grew stronger, he came to believe that God had indeed called him to this work. After careful self-examination, he sought counsel from Mr. Wilkes, who advised him to write to the directors of the London Missionary Society. In July 1816, John Williams submitted his application, a document marked by characteristic conscientiousness and sincerity. After describing his deep reflection and examination of his motives, he wrote,
"I have endeavoured to be as frank and plain as possible. If this, and the account which the Reverend Matthew Wilkes can give of me, should not meet with your conscientious approbation, I hope, pray, and trust that you will on no account, for the sake of my soul, offer me the least encouragement."
His application was accepted immediately, and Mr. Tonkin graciously released him from the remaining 7 months of his apprenticeship. Until his ordination on September 3rd, 1816, at Surrey Chapel, John Williams studied under the direction of the Reverend Matthew Wilkes. Along with 8 other men, he was solemnly set apart for missionary labour. His life from this point could well have borne the motto of Dr. Judson, "Devoted for life," for that is what he truly became. During the ordination service, Dr. Waugh addressed John Williams with these words,
"Go, dear young brother, and if thy tongue cleave to the roof of thy mouth, let it be with teaching poor sinners of the love of Jesus Christ. And if thy arm drop from thy shoulder, let it be by knocking at men's hearts to gain admission for him there."
Among the 8 new missionaries was Robert Moffat, and it was originally intended that Williams and Moffat be sent out together. However, Dr. Waugh visited Mr. Wilkes and expressed his concern, saying,
"Those two lads were too young to go together."
As a result, Moffat was sent to Africa, and John Williams embarked on his remarkable enterprises in the South Seas. He did not go alone, however, as his young wife accompanied him. A brief account of her must now be given. The Mongols are said to believe in a strange myth that somewhere on this earth exists a race of half-men, and that two individuals from this race must unite to form a complete being. This can serve as a fitting parable, for even a Christian man is incomplete until he is happily married. Much of life's unhappiness stems from the fact that sometimes the wrong halves are joined together. However, John Williams was fortunate in finding the perfect complement to his life in Mary Shawnna. As one person, well qualified to judge, remarked, "In Christian heroism, she proved the equal of her intrepid husband, and in patient endurance his superior. It is not flattery, but simple justice to say that she was in all respects worthy of the honoured man to whose happiness and success she so greatly contributed." At the time of her first acquaintance with John Williams, Mary Shawnna lived with her mother on Spencer Street, Goswell Road, London. Her father had once owned considerable property near Cheadle, Staffordshire, where his ancestors had lived since the Norman Conquest. However, a lawsuit over estates near Lichfield, to which he was heir, exhausted most of his inheritance. While in London, attending to this legal matter, he visited the Whitfield Tabernacle and heard John Hyatt preach. His enthusiastic report of the sermon inspired his wife and daughter to hear this remarkable preacher themselves. Their wish was unexpectedly fulfilled when, in 1808, Denston Hall, their ancestral home, was sold, and they moved to London. Mary Shawnna, the youngest daughter of the family, had long been under deep religious impressions, though these had not yet led to saving faith at that time. However, after moving to London, her convictions deepened, and she became a member of the Tabernacle Church. Like her future husband, she was deeply influenced by the missionary zeal of Reverend Matthew Wilkes, and her constant prayer was that she might be sent to the heathen to tell them of the love of Christ. On October 29th, 1816, Mary Shawnna married John Williams. Two portraits of the bride and groom, taken at this time, have been preserved in the London Missionary Society's museum. In these, Mary is depicted with a slight, girlish figure, delicate features, and expressive eyes. While some might find fault with her mouth, it is more than compensated for by the overall sweetness of her face. Her features convey both gentleness and strength. Her husband, though appearing quite young, displays an attractiveness that explains the strong friendships he often inspired. On November 17, 1816, the missionaries embarked on the Harriet for Sydney, from where they would reship to the South Seas. Shortly after boarding, Mr. Williams set to work making his cabin as comfortable as possible. Writing to his sister from Gravesend, he referred to the ship as his home. When someone on shore had asked him for the time, he responded,
"I have left my watch at home."
The reply was, "I am glad you find the ship to be so." To this, Mr. Williams added,
"And it is so."
His ability to create a sense of home wherever he was played a significant role in his happiness and success. A person's character can be tested by whether they feel desolate or at home in any given place. For home is more a reflection of the spirit than of external circumstances. Men like John Williams carry the elements of home within their own hearts, which enables them to uplift and support those less fortunate. Therefore, strive to be a homemaker, no matter where your life's path leads you. Chapter 2: A Stranger with Many Friends. During his voyage to the South Seas, John Williams carefully studied every part of the ship on which he sailed, though he likely did not realise at the time how invaluable this knowledge would prove to be in his future endeavours. His keen powers of observation and the subsequent training of his memory would become incalculably valuable. Unconsciously preparing himself for his unique form of service, he made the voyage to Rio de Janeiro both profitable and storm-free. At Rio, Mr. and Mrs. Threlkeld, his future colleagues in Raiatea, joined him. Here, Williams was deeply moved by the superstition and degradation he witnessed among the people. For the first time, he saw human beings being sold like cattle in booths. The sight of this dreadful practice distressed him so much that he returned to his quarters and wept bitterly. His outspoken sympathy for the enslaved nearly cost him his life. His strong remarks against slavery angered one man so much that he attempted to stab Williams. Fortunately, Williams evaded the attack, but after this, he wisely chose not to go ashore again in Rio. After leaving Rio, the mission party sailed to Sydney, arriving on May 2nd, 1817. From there, they reshipped and sighted Tahiti on November 16th, 1817. The following day, they landed on Aimeo, a neighbouring island that served as the missionary settlement. Like all visitors, Mr. Williams was captivated by the island's natural beauty, but he was even more impressed by the people, who had so recently emerged from the darkness of heathenism. Williams, like Robert Raikes, delighted in studying human nature. Although the people were still imperfect, significant improvements had been made in a remarkably short time. However, Williams, ever practical and energetic, was not content with mere observation. His working sympathy led him to realise that the natives' most pressing need was a vessel. Though one had been laid down 3 years earlier, it remained unfinished. Williams volunteered to complete the ironwork, and after 8 or 10 days of diligent labour, the ship was ready. Pamar, the king of Tahiti, named the vessel the Howes and used it for trade between his island and New South Wales. This Howes was the first of 5 vessels Williams would build during his missionary career, a remarkable achievement considering he had never received formal instruction in shipbuilding and had not even examined a ship prior to his voyage on the Harriet. This feat demonstrated the truth of the saying, "Things out of hope are oft compassed by venturing," and reflected the same concentration as the ancient king who, in every work that he began in the service of the house of God, did it with all his heart and prospered. Williams was equally successful in learning the native language. Rather than studying grammar and lexicons, he chose a method of his own, immersing himself among the people, talking with them and listening to their conversations. To the astonishment of his fellow missionaries, who expected it to take 3 years to learn the language, Williams was able to preach in Tahitian after only 10 months. During this period of language acquisition, his eldest son John, who would later become the British consul in Samoa, was born on January the 9th, 1818. While Williams was preparing himself through study and work, events were also unfolding to prepare a place for him. Several chiefs from the Society Islands had come to assist King Pomare in reclaiming his sovereignty. During their time in Tahiti, these chiefs had gained some knowledge of the gospel. Upon returning to their own islands, a ship carrying missionaries was driven by a storm to Raiatea, where the people, already receptive due to what their chiefs had heard in Tahiti, welcomed the missionaries' teaching. As a result, a chapel was built in Raiatea for divine worship. These same chiefs later returned to Tahiti to request teachers for their people. In response to their request, Messrs. Ellis, Williams, and Orsmond, along with their wives, relocated from Aimeo to Huahine. This island, the most easterly of the Society Islands, was accessible by the trade winds from all the surrounding islands, making it the ideal headquarters for the new mission. Mr. Ellis promptly established a printing press at Huahine, which quickly became one of the most important aspects of missionary work in the Society Islands. The books printed at Huahine circulated widely, some of them reaching Raiatea and falling into the hands of the king, who was so impressed that he visited Hua Hin to request teachers for his people. Raiatea was both the centre and the chief island of the group. Its kings had long held a kind of sovereignty over their neighbouring islands, more or less respected depending on the strength of the reigning monarch. Raiatea was also the religious capital, a Polynesian version of both London and Rome, where the gods resided. The island's centre was dominated by a towering mountain range that rose to 2,000 feet, surrounded by a fertile belt of land along the coast. The population at that time was estimated to be no more than 1,300 people. Recognising the strategic importance of Raiatea, it was decided that although Mr. Ellis and Mr. Osmond would remain at Hua Hin, John Williams and Mr. Threlkeld would accompany the king back to Raiatea. Tamatoa, the king of Raiatea, had already suffered for his new Christian faith. While in Tahiti, he had expected conflict with the adherents of the old religion and had asked,
"Suppose the idolaters reject my offers and are obstinate for war. Must we carry peace until the spear rests on our heads?"
He was advised to remain on the defensive, and upon his return to Raiatea, he wisely followed this counsel. The idolaters, outraged by his abandonment of their gods, incited each other to expel him, saying things like,
"Let him not have a landing place for his canoe. Let us expel the word of God from our land while it is still young."
Tamatoa, being cautious, did not interfere with the religious practices of his chiefs, but embarked on a tour of his kingdom. During this journey, his wife and some attendants ate pork, a food considered sacred and forbidden to women by the heathen, who saw women as unclean and vile. The uproar this caused led some of the heathens to poison a pig in an attempt to kill the Christians. But the plot fortunately failed. The leader of the heathens, sensing the time for war had not yet come, calmed his followers by saying,
"The fruit is not yet ripe."
Later, Tamatoa's wife went so far as to eat turtle, an even more sacred food, but even this provocation only drew the same remark.
"The fruit is not yet ripe."
The tension escalated when some of the king's servants, seeking shelter from the rain, took cloth wrapped around an idol to keep warm. Tamatoa was initially unaware of this act until he saw written in the sand,
"We were warm in the devil's cloth."
When he discovered what had happened, Tamatoa was furious, but his followers soothed him by suggesting that the cloth might have been a gift from God. One of the servants later sold a piece of the idol cloth to an unsuspecting man who wore it openly while walking through a heathen district. This final act prompted the heathen chief to declare, "The fruit is ripe," and they took up arms immediately. Despite their superior numbers, the heathens were defeated. Although they had threatened to commit atrocious acts against the Christians, after their anticipated easy victory, they were shown great kindness by their conquerors. This mercy softened their hearts towards the gospel and made the missionaries' work far easier than it might otherwise have been. When the mission party arrived in Raiatea on September 11th, 1818, they were warmly received. John Williams often remarked,
"Kindness is the key to the human heart."
and his experiences in Raiatea affirmed this belief. His own actions in the following years provided many examples of this truth in both Raiatea and other islands. One incident struck Williams as particularly curious upon landing. A native companion, feeling hungry, entered a house and without hesitation took the food from a Raiatean who was eating it. This act was not only permitted, but considered good manners in Raiatea, an interesting example of how different cultures have very different ideas of what constitutes proper behaviour. The spirit in which John Williams approached his work, which would grow into much larger enterprises, can be seen in a letter he wrote home shortly after his arrival.
"My dearest parents,"
He wrote,
Grieve not at my absence, for I am engaged in the best of services, for the best of masters, and upon the best of terms. But rather rejoice in having a child upon whom the Lord has conferred this honour.
In his new station, Williams quickly displayed his remarkable ability to make and keep friends. His sunny, affectionate nature endeared him to the Rioteans just as it had in England. Indeed, his work would have been impossible without this personal influence. The love and care he had for the people was indispensable, not just for remaining among them, but also for working for their well-being. The Rioteans were deeply degraded and their indolence seemed incurable. Much like a huntsman who once explained how he managed difficult jumps by saying, "I sent my heart over first, and then a ditch was no difficulty." Williams tackled the seemingly impossible task of improving the natives' lives by first giving them his heart. In this way, he accomplished things that would otherwise have been too challenging and unpleasant. Even the physical labour required to visit the scattered and isolated families of the island added to his difficulties, as the people lived in remote and disconnected patches with no means of communication except dangerous mountain paths. Williams knew that community was essential for improvement, and that breaking the power of bad customs and teaching the gospel could not be done without fellowship. He therefore set about gathering the people into a more unified society. As a first step, he encouraged them to form a settlement, and after agreeing on a location, Williams led by example by building a house for himself. This house was intended not only as his residence, but also as an education for the people, a tangible demonstration of the practical benefits of the gospel. He built it as well as circumstances allowed, and it accomplished his goal. The house appealed to the self-respect of the natives, offering even the most ignorant and understandable proof of the value of Christianity. The king and others soon began to build houses in imitation, and the project played a key role in training the people. The house was a remarkable structure, 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with 7 rooms, 4 in the front and 3 behind. The wooden frame was wattled and plastered, and Williams used coral to create an orange and grey colour scheme for the walls. The furniture inside, including sofas, chairs, and tables, was all crafted by Williams himself, and these items introduced new desires among the people for things they had never considered before. His energy in building the house and settlement led to rapid growth, and within a year, the settlement stretched 2 miles along the coast, bringing nearly 1,000 natives together, greatly to their advantage. Satisfied with this, Williams soon decided to build a boat. He aimed to make it 16 feet long, and when it was finished, it had hardly any nails in it, as the planks were tied together with native cord. Williams intended to use this boat to visit Taha, a small island near Raiatea within the same reef. This accomplishment showed the natives that they too could build boats without nails, and many resolved to try. To encourage them, Williams promised 50 nails to the first man who laid down a boat. It was a great pleasure to see the natives working at all, for their natural indolence was compounded by the land's fertility. Their few needs were easily met by simply picking fruit from trees or planting a few taro or sweet potatoes. By inspiring them to work, Williams took the first steps in transforming their lives and mindset. However, encouraging the Rioteans to work was not the only, nor even the primary, benefit they received from their teachers. Regarding the spiritual aspect of his mission, which underpinned all his other efforts, John Williams wrote,
"My work is my delight. In it I desire to spend and be spent. I think and hope that I have no other desire in my soul than to be the means of winning sinners for Christ. My anxiety is that my tongue may be ever engaged in proclaiming this salvation, and that my words and actions may always be pointing to the cross."
Happily, Williams's focus on the cross was not without saving results, as many of the natives became interested in the gospel. Some of their questions were unusual but deeply meaningful, reflecting the first stirrings of their minds in response to new and life-changing truths. For instance, one man asked,
"Who are the scribes?"
wondering if they were secretaries of a missionary society. Another man, troubled by evil thoughts, told the missionaries that he had once thought,
"If Satan would approach me in the likeness of man, I would fight him and stone him to death."
He worried he had sinned by entertaining such a thought. Yet another man, struggling with his prayers, asked if it was right to say,
"O Jehovah, give thy word into my heart, all thy word, and cover it up there, that it may not be forgotten by me."
The joy that these inquiries inspired was tempered by the sudden death of Mrs. Osmond, who had travelled with her husband from Hua Hin to stay at Raiatea. Her unexpected passing was a solemn reminder of mortality, but also likely spurred the missionaries to greater efforts. One of the most pressing issues they faced was the lawlessness and lack of social morality among the people. Their aim was to make life more meaningful and ordered, but they found this an extremely challenging task. In September 1819, after much deliberation, the chiefs were finally persuaded to convene a meeting to address these problems. The meeting resulted in a crucial agreement to uphold the sacredness of marriage as the foundation of social and national order. To repeat offenders, the chiefs said, "You had better go and serve the devil again. Let not this land be stained with sin." The arrival of several hundred copies of the Gospel around this time greatly assisted the missionaries, and as the people began to embrace a new way of life, they encouraged one another to learn to read. One touching story illustrates the hunger for instruction. After the school bell rang one day, a Raiatean found a man sitting at home, discouraged. The man said he had only gotten as far as learning ba, ba, a, and didn't want to try anymore. His friend reminded him that when fishing, he always concealed the hook and added, "The devil has a fish hook in that evil thought of yours. Therefore, have nothing to do with it. Let us go immediately and learn." In addition to this growing desire for education, several encouraging developments took place during the year. The most significant was the formation of an auxiliary missionary society. By the end of 12 months, the natives had contributed $500 to help cause the word of God to grow, in their own words. This generosity was widespread. Even the king and his wife prepared arrowroot with their own hands as a contribution.
"We would not give that to God,"
said Tamatoa,
upon which we bestowed no labor, but would rather prepare it with our own hands. And then we can say as David did, "Of our own proper good have we given unto thee."
Thus ended the first year of missionary work at Raiatea, marked by signs of progress. However, while John Williams fully committed himself to his immediate work, he was not content to limit his efforts to Raiatea. He famously said,
"Our hearts comprehend all the ends of the earth."
and from this point on, his life becomes even more fascinating as his work expanded to encompass the islands of the Pacific, which became his vast mission field. As his work in Raiatea prospered, Williams began constructing a new chapel for his growing congregation. This impressive structure measured 191 feet in length and 44 feet in width, with 40 feet of the length partitioned off as a courthouse. The entire building amazed the natives, especially the turned chandeliers, which Williams crafted himself, using coconut shells as lamps. On May 11, 1820, the chapel was opened for worship, and 2,400 people gathered within its walls. The following day saw another triumph for the missionary efforts. At a national assembly, a new code of laws was unanimously adopted, and the king's brother was appointed chief judge to enforce these laws. Encouraged by this reform, which he had long been working toward, Williams turned his attention to promoting profitable employment for the now law-abiding natives. He began cultivating sugarcane, which was indigenous to the islands, and even built a sugar mill for the people to use. However, as is often the case when doing good, opposition arose. Some of the heathens conspired to take William's life. After a visit to Bora Bora, an island about 20 miles south of Raiatea, he narrowly escaped one of many remarkable dangers, which he viewed as evidence of God's protective care. Every second or third Sabbath, Williams travelled to Taha, an island 8 miles away, setting out on Saturdays. 4 of the men who rowed him plotted to throw him into the sea and kill Meister Threlkeld and Tamatoa. But on the Wednesday before the planned murder, Williams repaired and painted his boat. When the paint had not dried by Saturday, he decided to postpone the voyage, despite the pleas of his men. This accidental delay thwarted the murder plot. Determined to kill him, the conspirators decided to attack him at home. The next day, a man appeared at William's house brandishing a carving knife and shouting, "Turn out the hog! Let us cut his throat!" Fortunately, the door was locked and Williams did not come out. When he finally opened the door, a friend arrived just in time to warn him, saying, "You are the pig he is calling for. You will be dead in a minute." The 4 ringleaders of the plot were sentenced to death, but at the missionaries' request, their lives were spared. The danger caused great distress to Mrs. Williams, leading to the premature birth of their second child, who sadly died the day after its birth. In that same eventful month of May 1820, the first annual meeting of the Native Missionary Society was held in the new chapel. At this gathering, one convert remarked, "A little property given with the heart becomes big property in the sight of God." Another encouraged his fellow believers, saying, "Let us now hold fast the word of God and die with it in our hands." The end of May, the first baptism was held at Raiatea, during which 70 individuals publicly professed their faith in Christ and their commitment to serve him. However, despite these successes, no missionary is free from seasons of discouragement. On July 7th, John Williams wrote to the directors expressing a desire to leave Raiatea. Although he was very popular on the island, Williams felt constrained by the smallness of Raiatea and believed that his abilities were being underutilized. He lamented that there was not enough work to occupy him. Yet, this restlessness did not stem from a lack of zeal or a mere desire for change.
"I have given myself wholly to the Lord and desire to spend my entire life in his service. I have no other desire in my soul but to live and die in the work of the Saviour."
This deep sense of consecration likely prevented him from leaving. And 5 months later, when Mr. Orsmond relocated to Bora Bora, more responsibilities naturally fell to Williams. In early 1821, Williams organised a conference aimed at deepening the spiritual life of his people. 300 schoolchildren were examined on their religious knowledge, and afterward, they were treated to a substantial dinner. Before the meal, the children paraded with flags they had made, bearing slogans like, "What a blessing the gospel is," and "Had it not been for the gospel, we should have been destroyed as soon as we were born." These statements were a poignant reminder of the island's dark past, where infanticide was a common practice. It had once been a trade or profession to kill newborn children, often by methods that were shockingly cruel. At the examination, an elderly chief stood up and addressed the king.
"Let me speak, I must speak. Oh, that I had known that the gospel was coming. Oh, that I had known that these blessings were in store for us. Then I should have saved my children, and they would have been among this happy group, repeating these precious truths. I shall die childless, although I have been the father of 19 children."
In March 1821, 2 months after the gathering, a significant event occurred when Awuru, the chief of Rurutu, an island 300 miles south of Raiatea, arrived at the mission station. A pestilence had struck his land, and he and another chief had each built a canoe, fleeing with as many people as their boats could carry. Uru spent 3 months with Williams, learning about the gospel, and then returned to Rurutu with 2 teachers. Soon after, the discarded idols of Rurutu were triumphantly brought to Raiatea. This victory greatly encouraged the Native Missionary Society, and contributions from the locals increased so much that by May they had collected an impressive £1,800 after paying all expenses. A remarkable gift from people who had only recently possessed no property at all. Around this time, the converts in Raiatea were formally organised into a Christian church based on congregational principles. Though Williams had previously expressed a desire to leave Raiatea, by this time he had lost all such inclinations. However, a severe illness suddenly overtook him, defying the medical expertise of his friends and necessitating a change of environment. His people were deeply grieved at the thought of even a temporary separation, but to their amazement and joy, the illness subsided without any medical intervention, which Williams attributed to the power of prayer. Not long after this, Williams received the heartbreaking news of his mother's death, which had occurred suddenly on September 23, 1819. In a letter to his family, he expressed his deep sorrow.
You seem to me now like a ship tossed about in a tempest without a pilot. Oh, thou brightest of examples, thou lover of Christ, thou most affectionate and beloved of mothers. My dear mother is no more. Oh, she's gone, never to return to us again. Shall we then wish her return? No, we dare not. But not to feel bitterly for one we so much loved, not to give vent to the ardour of our affection for so kind and excellent a mother, would require the hardest and most unfeeling heart, which none of us possess. My dearest mother's portrait is an inestimable treasure. The large one hangs in our bedroom, but since I have heard of her decease, I can hardly bear to look at it. I am endeavouring to overcome my feelings and let it continue to hang there as a faithful monitor to remind me frequently of her bright example. But I fear I must put it away. Our precious mother, our dearest mother.
In his grief, Williams found comfort in the hope of seeing his mother again in heaven, writing,
Another thought that has occupied my mind is that we shall see our dear mother again, and I have no doubt of our mutual recognition. Now, if we are found in Jesus, with what ecstatic joy will our beloved parent join with the redeemed of the Lord in welcoming her children into the regions of the blessed, to go no more out, to part no more forever. Oh, that this may be our happy portion.
An added bitterness to John Williams' grief over his mother's death was the fact that his surviving parent, his father, was not a Christian. In response, Williams wrote a heartfelt and affectionate letter, pleading with his father not to delay in turning to Christ, urging him earnestly toward repentance and faith. This letter proved to be timely. 7 years later, when William's father was on his deathbed, he proclaimed, "The Father is saved through the Son's instrumentality." Soon after receiving the sorrowful news of his mother's passing, John Williams baptized nearly 500 individuals, a significant event in the life of the mission. However, around this time, Williams's illness returned, and his wife also fell seriously ill. It became evident that medical attention was urgently needed, either in England or Australia. In September 1821, the ship Westmoreland, bound for Sydney, arrived at Raiatea, and Williams and his wife took passage aboard her. During the voyage, the Westmoreland stopped at Aitutaki on October 2nd, where 2 native teachers were left to begin mission work. The Aitutakians were heavily tattooed and adorned with pipeclay, red or yellow ochre, and charcoal. The chief of the island was astonished to hear that idolatry had been abolished in Raiatea, and he warmly welcomed the teachers. William's 4-year-old son attracted much attention from the islanders, who begged to keep him, promising to make him a king. When the parents declined, the natives began talking angrily among themselves, looking at the child and then over the side of the ship as if plotting to abduct him. Sensing the danger, Williams quickly sent the child below deck and took leave of the Aitutakians. In Sydney, Williams and his wife regained their health, and Williams immediately set about acquiring a ship to facilitate trade between the islands and New South Wales. Though the London Missionary Society's agent initially opposed the idea, Williams's determination won him over, and he assisted in the purchase of a new schooner, an 90-ton vessel named the Endeavour. The ship would later be renamed the Beginning by the natives. While in Sydney, Williams also hired a gentleman, whose salary he personally guaranteed, to teach the Rioteans the profitable cultivation of sugar and tobacco. He also loaded the Endeavour with shoes, clothing, tea, and other essential goods for the people of Raiatea. The governor of New South Wales generously added several cows and sheep as gifts for the island chiefs. The ship, the Endeavour, set sail from Sydney on April 23, 1822, stopping briefly in New Zealand and Rurutu before reaching Raiatea on June 6th. Upon his return, Williams learned that another conspiracy had been uncovered during his absence. The plot aimed to overthrow King Tamatoa, and 10 men had been sentenced to death for their involvement. However, their sentences had been commuted to hard labour for life, thanks to the intercession of Mr. Threlkeld. King Tamatoa was greatly pleased by the arrival of the ship, and he wrote to the directors of the London Missionary Society, expressing his gratitude.
A ship is good, for by its means useful property will come to our lands, and our bodies will be covered with decent cloth. But this is another use of the ship, when we compassionate the little lands near to us, and desire to send 2 from among us to those lands, to teach them the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good word of the kingdom.
In October of the following year, a deputation from England, sent by the directors of the London Missionary Society, visited Raiatea. Among their objectives was the introduction of cotton spinning and weaving to the native population, though, unfortunately, these efforts met with little success. However, the delegates were very pleased with John Williams and his work. In their reports back to England, they spoke highly of him, praising his dedication and achievements. At the same time, they expressed concern over the poor health of both Williams and his wife, fearing that their physical frailty might bring a premature end to their labour in Raiatea. Williams himself wrote home, expressing his deep longing for health and strength, not for worldly pursuits, but for the purpose of serving the mission.
Oh, for health and strength, not to give to the vanities of the world, not to amass the riches of the East, but to spend and to be spent among the perishing heathen. My God, give it. I think we want this only that we may devote it to his service. His cause lies near our hearts.
However, this prayer for health was not immediately answered, as his wife fell dangerously ill, and for a time her recovery seemed doubtful. By God's mercy, though, the fever that had taken hold of her began to subside, and before the new year dawned, she was miraculously restored to some degree of health.
Meanwhile, the Endeavour was sent to New South Wales with its first cargo, marking a successful step forward in trade.
No fewer than 150 plantations on the island had been cultivated to some extent, and the natives had prepared 3 or 4 tons of salt for export. Thus, despite the challenges and health scares, the year 1822 closed on a positive note, with signs of progress and hope for the future. Chapter 3. A Voyage with Many Discoveries, 1823 to 1827. Bronte said, "I long to prove by efforts new my speechless gratitude.
While it is yet day, I must be about my master's business, and he who helps me onward is twice my friend."
John Williams, in a letter to his directors towards the end of 1823, wrote the following words that reflected his restless energy.
For my own part, I cannot content myself within the narrow limits of a single reef, and if means are not afforded, a continent would to me be infinitely preferable, for there, if you cannot ride, you can walk.
These words express the spirit that led to the remarkable expansion of his missionary work that year.
His discovery of Rarotonga in 1823 marked the beginning of what would become the fruitful mother of many missions. The immediate cause of this new enterprise was a report from 2 teachers stationed in Aitutaki. Initially ridiculed by the natives as 2 logs of driftwood cast up by the sea, the teachers later gained respect. The people promised that if Mr. Williams visited them again, they would abandon their idols. In response, on July 4, 1823, John Williams and Mr. Bourne set sail from Raiatea with 6 native teachers. During the voyage, Williams prepared a series of counsels for these native helpers, revealing his deep commitment to the cause. He urged them to
work well and pray much,
reminding them of the sacrifice of Jesus and the fact that the people they would serve were
purchased with his blood.
He also warned that the heathen
will watch you with rat's eyes, looking for little crooked places in your conduct.
His advice reflected his own tireless dedication.
Remember well your work. Give to it your hands, your mouths, your bodies, your souls, and God bless your labours.
He emphasized the importance of diligence, stating,
a lazy missionary is both an ugly and a useless being.
In closing, he encouraged them to remain faithful.
Have singleness of heart to Jesus and his gospel. Search his word and pray that he will not leave nor forsake you.
The voyage concluded on July 9th, when they landed in Aitutaki. Williams found that the good word had indeed taken root. As the natives crowded around the vessel, they displayed their newfound faith by holding up hats and books and reciting parts of the Catechism or Grace before meals. On shore, Williams observed that the teachers had set an example of industry, leading the people to build homes modelled after theirs. The people had abandoned idolatry, ceased eating human flesh, and constructed a large chapel which they invited Williams to declare open. Ingeniously, the pulpit and chapel walls were made from wattling, plastered, and then whitewashed. The process of whitewashing astonished the natives, who exclaimed,
"The very stones in the sea and the sand on the shore become good property in the hands of those who worship the true God and regard his word."
This success in just 18 months filled Williams with hope. In his journal, he wrote,
I hope for great things, pray for great things, and confidently expect great things to result from these labours.
While in Aitutaki, Williams met some natives of Rarotonga who had been blown off course in a storm. They had become Christians and desired to return home, so he took them aboard, accompanied by the king of Aitutaki, along with 31 of the king's discarded idols stored in the ship's hold, and Papeha, one of Aitutaki's teachers. Williams set sail in search of Rarotonga. For 8 days they searched without success and eventually redirected their course to Mangaya. At first, the people of Mangaya were timid, but after Papeha visited them, they agreed to receive teachers. However, things quickly turned sour. The teachers' goods were seized, and one man even broke a saw into 3 pieces to wear as earrings. Papeha himself was attacked. A piece of cloth was twisted around his head in an attempt to strangle him, and others faced even worse treatment. When Papeha confronted the chief about these betrayals, the chief simply replied,
"In Mangaya, all heads are equal."
Faced with this hostility, Williams decided not to leave any teachers among the Mangayan people. However, upon returning home, he resolved to send 2 single men as missionaries to Mangaya. These 2 were eventually well received by the people, who attributed a pestilence that broke out among them to the wrath of the god of the strangers. From Mangaya, the missionaries proceeded to Atiu, where 2 native preachers had been living for 2 or 3 months. Unfortunately, they were not thriving, having been stripped of their belongings and even suffering from hunger. The chief of Atiu came aboard the mission ship, and the king of Aitutaki eagerly sought to convert him. He took the chief to the hold of the vessel, showing him the once dreaded idols now treated with contempt.
With little difficulty, he persuaded the chief to renounce idolatry. The new convert led the missionaries to 2 small islands under his control, where he abolished idolatry and encouraged his people to accept the Christian teachings. These islands, Martyr and Mitiaro, were inhabited by simple people. Upon seeing the goats that Mr. Williams had brought, they exclaimed in wonder, calling them
birds with great teeth in their heads.
The King of Attu informed Mr. Williams that Rarotonga was not more than 9 days' sail away and gave him the bearings for the island. Despite warnings from the natives of Aitutaki, who described the Rarotongans as treacherous and fierce cannibals, Williams persisted in his search. For 5 days, they sailed without finding land, and with provisions running low, Mr. Williams promised to turn back if land was not sighted by 8 a.m. Remarkably, just half an hour before the search was to be abandoned, the lookout spotted land. Peha, along with another native, went ashore and addressed a large crowd. The king of Rarotonga, Makea, soon boarded the Endeavour and readily promised to protect the teachers who had come for his people. Among the Rarotongans, brought back by the Endeavour, was the king's cousin, whom Makea greeted warmly. Confident in Makea's promise, the teachers were left ashore, but that night they were so mistreated that Williams refused to let them remain. Peha, ever courageous in the face of danger, volunteered to stay alone in Rarotonga if a colleague he named could later join him. This was deemed the only viable option, and for 4 months Papeha laboured alone, relying on the help of a few early converts. His efforts bore fruit, and within a year they had built a chapel 600 feet long.
As in many other places, God had already begun preparing the way. A heathen woman, before the Endeavour's arrival, had brought news of the gospel from Tahiti. After hearing her account, King Makea named 2 of his children Jehovah and Jesus Christ. An altar had even been built to Jehovah and Jesus Christ, and it became famous for its supposed healing powers. The unknown God they worshipped was revealed to them by the faithful Papeha.
The first to respond to Papeha's message was a chief who learned how to pray from him. So eager was this chief to master the prayer that he repeatedly woke Papeha during the night, saying, "I have forgotten it. Go over it again."
Others were intrigued by Papeha's New Testament, remarking,
"There is the God of that man. What a strange God it is. He carries it about with him."
An amusing incident from this time involved a favourite cat that had been brought ashore from the Endeavour. The cat wandered into the house of a priest who had renounced his idols under Papeha's influence. One night, the priest's wife, seeing the cat's eyes glowing in the dark, woke her husband and urged him to pray, believing it to be a supernatural creature. The cat fled before the prayer was finished and took up residence in an abandoned idol temple. The local worshippers, unfamiliar with such animals, cried out in fear when they saw it, exclaiming,
"Here's a monster from the deep."
Sadly, the cat met an untimely end at the hands of some brave warriors.
Without knowing what Papeha's work in Rarotonga would accomplish, John Williams returned home, leaving his devoted helper alone on the island. His first missionary voyage had lasted about 5 weeks. After returning to Raiatea, he wrote to his father, expressing his unshaken commitment.
I am as much alive to missionary work as from the first day I set my foot on these shores, and in the work of my Lord and Saviour I desire to live and to die. My highest ambition, dear Father, is to be faithful to my work, faithful to souls, and faithful to Christ. In a word, to be abundantly and extensively useful.
Being a man of such conviction, it was unsurprising that he could not remain idle at Raiatea. He soon set out in a small schooner to visit the islands of Rurutu and Rimatara. In both places, he was more than satisfied with the progress of the mission. In Rurutu, he had the joy of administering the Lord's Supper for the first time to 16 people, the first fruits of the mission there. However, as is often the case, great success was followed by a significant trial. That time, some self-serving merchants had influenced the governor of New South Wales to impose a duty on tobacco brought from the South Sea Islands. This decision struck a severe blow to the budding industries of sugar-making, coconut oil trade, and pearl shell gathering, all of which were now adversely affected by the new fiscal policy. To make matters worse, Williams received a letter from his directors reprimanding him for purchasing the Endeavour. Though he still believed his decision was right, Williams immediately called the chiefs together and shared the troubling news. The chiefs decided to load the Endeavour with native produce and sell both the cargo and the ship in Sydney, hoping to gain whatever they could in light of the new circumstances. Though Williams remained loyal to his directors, he deeply lamented the decision.
Satan knew well that this ship was the most fatal weapon ever formed against his interests in the great South Sea, and therefore, as soon as he felt the effects of its first blow, he wrested it out of our hands.
Despite his appeals, the directors refused to provide him with another ship, even though Williams warned that trading vessels, which he referred to as
the very arks of Satan,
would otherwise continue to visit. Yet, being a man of resilience, Williams did not allow this disappointment to weaken his resolve. Instead, he focused his energy on new initiatives in Raiatea. Among his efforts was the organisation of a solemn meeting on New Year's Day, 1824, for reflection and rededication to God's service. After a substantial meal, the day continued with serious spiritual engagements. King Tamatoa himself spoke at the gathering, advising his people,
"Let not our profession be like the bamboo, which, when lighted, blazes most furiously, but leaves no firebrand or charcoal behind for future use."
Shortly after this meaningful event, one of the trading vessels Williams had warned against, a ship laden with spirits, arrived on the island. Unable to sell his cargo in Raiatea, the captain, in an act of spite,
lured 2 or 3 women onto his vessel and sailed away with them on board.
But an even greater challenge than the scandal caused by the captain's abduction of the women soon arose. The settlement on Raiatea was situated in an area exposed to violent tempests that swept down from the central mountains. These devastating tornadoes disheartened the people. So Mr. Williams suggested they move to a more sheltered location on the other side of the island. The natives agreed, and soon a new settlement stretched nearly 4 miles along the seashore, this time on the windward side, or the north of Raiatea. Though this relocation meant much additional labour for Williams, he did not entirely regret it.
The South Sea Islanders, like Hayden, who confessed he needed a great work to keep his mind excited, were prone to lapsing into indolence once settled. The migration, therefore, was beneficial, as it forced them to work again. Shortly after the relocation, the mission suffered a loss. On March 7th, Mrs. Threlkeld passed away, and her husband returned to England with their 4 motherless children, one still an infant. Despite these trials, or perhaps even strengthened by them, the native church continued to thrive, with the number of baptized members reaching 900. Troublemakers and busybodies were promptly expelled from the community, a policy the Raiatean church followed with a rigour that might serve as a good example for older churches elsewhere. Among the visitors who brought encouragement was the chief of Rurutu, who had not forgotten the missionaries' help. He brought with him a young man for Mr. Williams to train in the mechanical skills in which he excelled. While overseeing the young man's education, Williams also found time to continue translating the scriptures into the native language. How he managed to excel in so many tasks simultaneously remains a mystery, though it may be attributed to his ability, like Fowl Buxton, to bring a whole man to bear upon everything that he undertook. His wife, too, was industrious, devoting herself to acts of mercy, including overseeing a class for lame, deaf, and blind elderly women. One of these women, reflecting on their care, remarked,
"We were laid aside as castaways, but now we begin to live again."
Although no examples of Mrs. Williams' teaching have been preserved, an anecdote illustrates her husband's ability to instruct. He once spoke to a chief who had hindered the teachers in their work. Using a simple illustration, Williams said,
20 men can easily drag a heavy log from the mountain to the sea if all pull at one rope and at one end. But if a rope is tied to each end, and 10 men pull one way and 10 the other, they will never move the log to the sea.
Such practical instruction contributed to the growth of the mission. The work expanded so much that a new and larger chapel was opened on February 8, 1826, in the new settlement. Around this time, Mr. and Mrs. Pitman arrived from England, answering Williams's call for additional labourers to serve in Rarotonga. They initially stayed in Raiatea to run the school and learn the language. To Mr. Pitman, Williams lamented,
Had I a ship at my command, not one island in the Pacific, but should, God permitting, be visited, and teachers sent to direct the wandering feet of the heathen to happiness, to heaven.
Yet his pleas for a ship fell on deaf ears, forcing him to wait, though not idly. During this time, Williams taught himself how to manufacture ropes, constructing the necessary machinery by hand.
The cables he produced were sold to ship captains, opening a new industry for the Raiateans.
In a letter to his sisters in England, Williams shared a humorous story about a Raiatean solution for dealing with a scolding wife.
I have a young man working for me who is good-natured and very amusing. His wife loves him dearly, but is sometimes afflicted with a terrible itch under the tongue, and when it strikes, she must scold. The young man listens patiently to her outbursts, and, while she scolds, quietly opens the New Testament and begins to read aloud. The wife bursts out, Why does this fellow read the word of God? The husband calmly replies, To calm your troubled spirit, my dear, and to support me against the volleys of your wrath, lest my own anger should be kindled. Realizing that her scolding is futile, the wife embraces her husband, smiles at her own folly, and promises to control her tongue in the future.
Towards the end of 1826, on November 28th, Mr. Williams' second son was born. He was named Tamatoa after the king of Raiatea, a close friend of his father. That son, the Reverend Samuel Tamatoa Williams, would later become the successful and esteemed minister of the Congregational Church at Catford Hill, Kent.
Chapter 4. A Trouble with Many Blessings.
1827 to 1830. J.R. Lowell said, The love of all things springs from the love of one. Wider the soul's horizon hourly grows, and over it, with fuller glory flows, the sky-like Spirit of God. On April 26, 1827, Mr. Williams left Raiatea for a second visit to Rarotonga. Mr. and Mrs. Pitman, who had been appointed to work on the island, accompanied him to their new home. Unfortunately, the voyagers did not reach Rarotonga until May 6th. Lacking a suitable harbour for the ship, the missionaries and their wives were lowered into a boat 3 miles from shore. During this process, Mr. Williams narrowly escaped a tragic accident. While handing down his son Samuel, a wave slammed him against the ship, with the infant still in his arms. Both father and child would have been crushed between the ship and the boat if Mrs. Pitman hadn't quickly grabbed Mr. Williams by the coat and pulled him into the boat. Adding to the tension, the boat began leaking badly and could only stay afloat because Mrs. Williams sat in the bottom and bailed out the water.
Eventually, they reached the shore safely and were warmly welcomed by hundreds of natives crowding the beach. However, their relief was short-lived. 3 days after landing, they received a letter from the ship's captain, informing them that the vessel had been damaged by the waves and could no longer safely remain anchored. Williams and Pitman immediately returned to the ship to retrieve some clothes and a few other essentials, though they had to leave most of their belongings behind. They then faced a difficult 7-mile journey back to shore in a heavy gale. Fortunately, a canoe from the shore came to their aid, and they landed safely to the joy of their waiting friends. When Mr. Williams first arrived in Rarotonga, he intended to stay for only 3 months. Little did he know that the island would become his home for the next 12 months, and that it was there he would build his famous ship, the Messenger of Peace. Unaware of the successes and trials ahead, he assisted in relocating the settlement to the eastern side of the island, a decision made before his arrival. To his great delight, he soon witnessed a powerful scene of conversion. He was asked to sit outside his house, and a long procession of natives filed past, laying their idols at his feet. The smallest of these discarded gods was 5 feet long and over 4 inches in diameter, made of ironwood wrapped in thick rolls of native matting. On the Sabbath, following this public renunciation of idolatry, a congregation of 4,000 gathered for worship. Since the existing chapel was too small to hold the crowd, the next day a public meeting was held, and it was decided to build a new chapel capable of seating 3,000 people. In just 7 weeks, the structure was completed, a remarkable achievement, given that 5 years earlier, none of the natives had ever seen or used an axe or plane. During the chapel's construction, 2 notable incidents occurred. In one, Mr. Williams, while working on the building, realized he had forgotten a tool at home. He wrote a request on a chip of wood and asked one of the chiefs to deliver it to Mrs. Williams. The chief, puzzled, said,
"She will call me a fool and scold me if I carry a chip to her. What shall I say?"
Williams replied,
"You have nothing to say. The chip will say all that I wish."
Bewildered, the chief asked,
How can it speak? Does it have a mouth?"
Despite his skepticism, the chief took the chip to Mrs. Williams, who read the message, discarded the chip, and gave him the needed tool. Perhaps no incident during Mr. Williams' time in Rarotonga, apart from his shipbuilding efforts, is as captivating as his account of Batave. Dr. Campbell once remarked, "One hardly knows whether to admire this man's temporal or spiritual industry more."
Batave, whose hands and feet had been eaten away by disease, was forced to walk on his knees. Despite this, he skillfully cultivated his small patch of land, providing enough food for his wife and 3 children. His only tool was a piece of pointed ironwood, which he used by pressing his full body weight on it to pierce the ground. He then scooped out the loosened soil with his wrist stumps and planted his crops. In the same way, he removed weeds. One evening, Batave greeted Mr. Williams with the words,
"Welcome, servant of God, who brought light to this dark island."
After listening to Batave recount the story of Christ's incarnation and death, Mr. Williams asked him,
"You pray, of course?"
"Oh, yes,"
Batave replied.
"I often pray as I weed my ground and plant my food, but always 3 times a day, and also with my family every morning and evening."
The rest of the conversation is best shared in Mr. Williams' own words.
"I asked him what he said when he prayed. He answered, 'I say, O Lord, I am a great sinner. May Jesus take my sins away by his good blood. Give me the righteousness of Jesus to adorn me, and give me the good spirit of Jesus to instruct me and make my heart good, to make me a man of Jesus and take me to heaven when I die.' Well, I replied, that Batave is very excellent, but where did you obtain your knowledge? From you, of course, he answered. Who brought us the news of salvation but yourself? True, I said, but I do not ever remember seeing you at any of the settlements to hear me speak of these things. How did you gain such knowledge? As the people return from the services, Batave explained, I sit by the wayside and ask them for a bit of the word as they pass. One person gives me one piece, another gives me another, and I gather them all together in my heart. By thinking over what I have collected and praying to God to help me understand, I come to know a little about his word."
Mr. Williams commented,
"His knowledge was such as to fill me with astonishment and delight, and I seldom passed his house after that without having an interesting conversation with him."
Despite such encouraging experiences, Mr. Williams could not remain content in Rarotonga. His thoughts turned to the converts he had left behind in Raiatea, and much like the Arab warrior who rode into the waters of the Atlantic, longing to carry his religion to new lands. Mr. Williams began to ponder the islands, yet unreached by the gospel. This deep longing, which he believed was a call from God, had already stirred within him before he left Raiatea, leading him to resolve to visit the Samoan Islands.
"You will be 1,800 miles away,"
she said.
"gone for 6 months and among the most savage people we know. If you lose your life, I will be left a widow with fatherless children 20,000 miles from my friends and my home."
Out of respect for her concerns, Mr. Williams abandoned the plan and never mentioned it to her again. But now, while in Rarotonga, Mrs. Williams fell gravely ill, her life seemingly hanging by a thread. During this time of affliction, she deeply reflected on her past and eventually concluded that her sickness was a punishment for opposing her husband's desire to spread the gospel to Samoa. Once she arrived at this conviction, she said to her husband,
"From now on, you have my full support. When you go, I will follow you with my prayers every day, asking God to preserve you, bless your efforts with success, and bring you back safely."
Mr. Williams immediately exclaimed,
"This is the finger of God,"
and resolved to undertake the voyage without delay. For some months, no ship had visited Rarotonga, and since Mr. Williams was never more himself than when circumstances demanded an unusual amount of skill and labour, he resolved to build a vessel. Though he had no prior knowledge of shipbuilding and lacked the necessary tools, which he first had to construct, he managed to build a vessel of 70 to 80 tons in less than 3 months. Remembering the purpose for which he designed the ship, which he named the Messenger of Peace, it has been rightly described as no less the evidence of his fervent piety than of his matchless skill. The story of this achievement reads like a romance, but it is too long to recount here. As an example of the difficulties he faced, it is worth noting that when he began the project, he had no bellows adequate for smith's work. Determined to make a pair himself, he had the only 4 goats on the island slaughtered, and their skins were prepared for the purpose. Unfortunately, the bellows he made did not work as expected. Worse yet, rats ate every scrap of leather, leaving only 2 bare boards behind. Undaunted by this setback, Mr. Williams tried again. This time, he crafted a wooden box that pumped air in the same way a pump moves water. With this invention, he was able to complete all the ironwork necessary for the vessel. Due to a shortage of nails, however, most of the timbers were fastened with long wooden pins. The natives were overjoyed when they witnessed iron being welded for the first time.
"Why did we not think of heating the hard stuff?"
they exclaimed.
"Instead of beating it with stones, what a reign of dark hearts Satan's is!"
After the ship was successfully launched, she made a trial voyage to Aitutaki, about 170 miles from Rarotonga. Makea, the king of Rarotonga, accompanied Mr. Williams on this journey, which confirmed the seaworthiness of the Messenger of Peace. From Aitutaki, they returned with a cargo of coconuts, pigs, and cats. The cats quickly reduced the population of rats that had previously swarmed over Rarotonga. Upon his return, Mr. Williams found that while he was away, the natives had removed the rubbish accumulated during the construction of the Messenger of Peace. They had replanted shrubs and repaired fences, saying,
"We will not leave a chip against which, on his return, he shall strike his feet."
Mr. Williams' departure was further facilitated by the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Buzzacott, who landed at Rarotonga in February 1828. Mr. Buzzacott had brought with him a quantity of iron, which was invaluable in reinforcing the Messenger of Peace. But he also brought troubling news from Raiatea. The teacher left in charge there had died, and his successor had proved unequal to the task, leading to discord among the people. At Rurutu, the 2 teachers had quarrelled, and 2 mission boats had been lost at sea, resulting in the tragic loss of 76 lives. Leaving Mr. Buzzacott under Mr. Pitman's care, Mr. Williams set out for Tahiti, which he reached after a 14-day sail. From there,
he proceeded to Raiatea, arriving on April 26, 1828. In a generous gesture, he lent the Messenger of Peace to the London Missionary Society, and Mr. Pritchard and Mr. Simpson used her to visit the Marquesas Islands, where they hoped to establish a mission. They were gone for about 12 months and later visited the Hervey Islands. During this period, Mr. Williams worked tirelessly to bring order to the mission's affairs. Upon his return from Itutaki, he received the news of his father's death. Not long after, death entered his own household, claiming his newborn child. Despite these heavy losses, which Mr. Williams felt keenly, he was greatly encouraged by a successful missionary meeting. Large crowds of Christians came from neighbouring islands, and at one point, 10 large-decked boats lay in the harbour. Able to leave Raiatea himself, Mr. Williams sent a small schooner-rigged boat to visit the remote mission settlements. This was the first expedition commanded by a native, and to Mr. Williams' joy, it was highly successful. In early 1829, Mr. Williams was able to visit Rurutu personally. There, he investigated charges against Puna, the native teacher, and not only acquitted him, but also commended his work. While in Rurutu, Mr. Williams met a native chief, Philip of Tubi, who had been waiting on the island for more than 2 years, hoping to secure a teacher for his homeland. During this long exile, his wife and 2 children had died, but he had refused to return home until his mission was accomplished. "I have been bearing all patiently," said the noble chief, "as I hope to effect an object that will be good for my land." Mr. Williams was away from Raiatea for 5 weeks during this voyage. Upon his return, he was encouraged by the arrival of 3 successive vessels whose officers provided much-needed assistance to the missionaries. The first to arrive was the Satellite sloop of war. The second was the U.S. ship Vincennes, whose chaplain wrote of the mission.
Much as the sincerity and piety of the church members on this island have been doubted, from all that I have observed, I was led to the fervent prayer that I might myself at last be equally worthy with many of these to have a seat at the marriage supper of the Lamb.
An even stronger testimony to the triumph of the gospel came from the commander of HMS Seringapatam, the 3rd vessel to visit Raiatea around this time. His opinion was especially valuable, as he and his officers initially doubted the piety and sincerity of the natives. When Mr. Williams heard of their suspicions, he suggested that the officers personally examine the converts, a proposal they agreed to. In 3 houses, the Englishmen posed a series of questions, receiving answers that clearly convinced them the natives were not merely parroting words they had learned without understanding their meaning. One example of native reasoning came from an old priest when asked, "Do you believe the Bible to be the Word of God and Christianity to be of divine origin?" Man raised his hands, moved his fingers and wrists rapidly, opened and closed his mouth, and then lifted his leg, moving it in different directions.
"I have hinges all over me,"
he said.
"If I wish to handle anything, the hinges in my hands enable me to do it. If I want to utter anything, the hinges in my jaws enable me to speak. If I wish to go anywhere, the hinges in my legs enable me to walk. When I look into the Bible, I see their wisdom that corresponds exactly with the wisdom in my body. I conclude, therefore, that the maker of my body is the author of that book."
This argument, reminiscent of Paley's design theory, completely convinced the officers that neither this man nor the other converts were as they had suspected. They happily testified to the intelligence of these insightful reasoners. After the Seringapatam had left the island, Mr. and Mrs. Williams made a brief visit to Tahiti, where they took their 2 sons for education. Not long after their return home, a devastating hurricane struck Rarotonga. The storm uprooted large trees, demolished several houses, and partially unroofed the chapel. While Mr. Williams was busy repairing the damage caused by the hurricane, the Messenger of Peace returned to the island. She entered the harbour on February 25, 1830, and Mr. Williams immediately began preparations for his long-anticipated visit to the Samoan Islands. Chapter 5, A Sowing with Many Harvests. 1830 to 1832. Keble said, "Who loves the Lord aright, no soul of man can useless find. All will be precious in his sight, since Christ on all hath shined." Dr. Campbell stated, "Next to the duty of personally receiving the truth is the duty of diffusing it." Although the expected supplies from England had not yet arrived, Mr. Williams embarked on his voyage to Samoa about a fortnight after the departure of the Seringapatam. Mr. Barth accompanied him, and the missionaries brought several native teachers from Raiatea as evangelists for the new field of labour they were opening. Mr. Williams had been stationed at Raiatea for 11 years when he departed from the island on May 24, 1830, to undertake this new expedition. Although it was out of the direct course, the messenger of peace visited the Hervey group, arriving at Mangaia after a 5-day journey. The mission station came into view on Sunday evening, and the missionaries went ashore the following morning. It will be remembered that the first teachers had been so shamefully mistreated by the natives that Mr. Williams had withdrawn them from Mangaia. However, the 2 single men who had since taken up the work had experienced such remarkable success that nearly 500 Christians welcomed Mr. Williams. Though still quite ignorant in many respects, they seized the opportunity of his visit to ask about their various concerns. For instance, they were deeply troubled about the lawfulness of eating rats. It had been a common native saying, when describing a delicacy, to say,
"It is as sweet as a rat."
These rats were caught in holes dug for that purpose, their hair singed off on hot stones, and then, after being wrapped in leaves, they were baked. Although baked rat had previously been regarded as the national dish, the new disciples now questioned whether it was permissible to eat. Mr. Williams advised them to take good care of the pigs and goats he had sent them, suggesting that with those, they would not need rat meat, which Europeans generally found very repulsive. A more significant challenge arose from the fact that women had previously been forced to labour for hours in the sweet potato fields. Mr. Williams interceded on their behalf, and from then on, the women were freed from this degrading and unhealthy work. He was also able to calm the hostility of the heathen party, which was strong in Mangaia and deeply enraged against the gospel. Eventually, the conduct of the idolaters, who persisted in dancing near the place of worship and repeatedly threatened to kill the Christians and burn their houses, led to a conflict in which the heathens were defeated. Unfortunately, the victors acted so mercilessly towards the vanquished that the heathens remained bitterly resentful, though they were powerless to harm the Christians. Though the situation had not yet escalated into actual warfare, Mr. Williams did his utmost to pacify both sides. He also considered transferring one of the teachers to Samoa, but even the heathens asked that the teacher remain, and so he stayed in Mangaia. From Mangaia, the messenger of peace sailed to Atiu, an island 2 days away. Significant progress had also been made there, thanks to the efforts of the 2 dedicated teachers stationed on the island. However, the teachers' wives complained that their husbands had to work so hard throughout the week, particularly on Saturdays when they fished all day to provide food for Sunday, that it became difficult for them to teach on the Lord's Day. During their husbands' absences, the women would write down on slates any parts of sermons they could recall from the missionaries, but they pleaded earnestly for sermon helps.
"You are like springs from which knowledge constantly bubbles forth. You only need to open your mouth, and out it flows."
While at Tonga, a chief from the Fiji Islands expressed his desire for teachers, and the missionaries agreed that the Wesleyan Society would take responsibility for the Fiji group, while the Samoan Islands would be left to the London Missionary Society. The wisdom of this arrangement is evident, and the remarkable success of both missions can likely be attributed to the faithfulness with which this compact was observed. Given the natural differences in temperament, variations in belief are inevitable, even among those who hold fast to the doctrines of the cross. However, it is surely wise, when dealing with the heathen, not to elevate such differences into a matter of religion, which could hinder the progress of new converts.
After concluding this important arrangement, Mr. Williams, accompanied by Mr. Cross, one of the Tongan missionaries, proceeded to Lafuga, a station of the Wesleyan Society. Unfortunately, the pilot mistook the channel, placing the ship in danger. For 2 days, they navigated through sunken rocks, sandbanks, and small islands before finally reaching a safe anchorage. At Lafuga, they encountered Finau, a chief of the Vava'u Islands, where Mr. Williams intended to leave a teacher. Finau promised to protect the teacher's life, but declared that if any of his subjects became Christians, he would certainly put them to death. This was not an empty threat, as Finau had long been determined in his opposition to the gospel. When his relative, the chief of Lafuga, abandoned idol worship, Finau sent him a large war canoe as a bribe to return to heathenism. However, the chief of Lafuga nobly refused the gift, stating that, valuable as the canoe was, the conditions attached to it made it worth no more than firewood in his eyes. In Vava'u, many remained firm in their commitment to the gospel. As Finau persecuted them, they abandoned their families and possessions and fled to Lafuga, where they enjoyed Christian teaching and religious freedom. Mr. Williams quickly realized there was no opportunity for mission work in Vava'u, and, without wasting time on a futile effort, set sail for Samoa. 7 long days, their journey was marked by violent storms, which they were less able to withstand due to an outbreak of influenza that incapacitated the crew. At last, to their great relief, they sighted the peaks of Sowing, the largest island in the Samoan group. These islands, sometimes called the Navigators' Islands, number 8 in total and are divided into the Windward and Leeward groups. The natives of the Windward group have a distinctive nasal pronunciation of many words, which is not shared by the others. Samoa is the native name for the cluster. The mountains of Sowing are covered with lush foliage up to their summits, and the peaks are visible from a distance of 70 miles. The soil of Samoa is very fertile, and since the introduction of the gospel, it has been cultivated with great success. Large crops of maize, cotton, nutmeg, coffee, sugarcane, arrowroot, tapioca, barley, and rice are now harvested from these dry soils. The water supply is excellent, fed by springs that never run dry and sustained by abundant rainfall. Nearly every ravine contains a torrent, fed by countless rivulets and cascading waterfalls. However, few of these streams reach the sea as the thirsty land absorbs them like a sponge, leaving a dry bed of stones to mark the river's channel near the coast. When Mr. Williams first encountered the natives, they were not as successful in farming as they are now, having since been instructed by European teachers. However, their natural ingenuity was evident in the construction of both their canoes and houses. Their boats were made from small pieces of breadfruit, carefully fitted together. Each section had a small ridge along its edge, pierced with holes through which lashings of sine, a native twine, were passed, firmly holding the structure together. The outer surface was quite smooth, and Mr. Williams remarked,
"A new canoe is really a handsome and ingenious piece of workmanship, very different from the thick, awkward Tahitian canoes. I do not think that their skill in the construction of canoes is surpassed by any islanders in the South Seas, with the sole exception of the King's Mill Islanders. These people build their canoes similarly to a whale boat, using small planks no wider than 2 inches, all lashed together by sine."
In describing the natives' houses, Mr. Williams continued,
"They also display considerable taste in their construction. The spacious houses, built for public gatherings, are neatly and sturdily assembled. They are shaped between a round and an oval. First, 2 or 3 large posts are set in the ground to support a short ridge pole about 4 to 6 feet in length. Rafters and thatch are then placed on this ridgepole, forming the rounded ends of the building. The rafters, made from breadfruit wood, are often no thicker than a finger. Though only about 2 feet in length, they are so neatly joined and securely lashed with sinnet that the joints are barely noticeable. The sugar-cane leaf is used for thatching, though the inside thatch does not appear as neat as in Tahitian houses. However, the rafters are far more refined, being smaller, carefully arranged, and well joined. These large public buildings are usually open on all sides, and have mats laid down as carpets. They are often 40 to 50 feet long, and about 30 to 35 feet wide. The natives' dwelling houses are similar in material and shape, but are much smaller and lower.
Now we turn to the events that followed Mr. Williams's arrival. His landing in Samoa was both remarkable and timely, exemplifying the mysterious leadings of Providence. God had been preparing the way for him in a truly remarkable manner. The Samoans had recently been influenced by a prophecy from a dying chief who predicted that the worship of spirits would soon cease throughout Samoa, and that a great white chief would come from beyond the horizon to overthrow their religion. He foretold that this would happen shortly after his death. This prophecy predisposed the people in Mr. Williams's favour and was just one of several circumstances that facilitated his success.
Most notably, just a few days before his arrival, Tamafainga had been killed. There had not yet been time to appoint a successor, thus removing what would have been an almost insurmountable obstacle to the success of the gospel. Mr. Williams's companion, Fowea, a Samoan chief, was so aware of this providential event that upon hearing of Tamafainga's death, he danced on the deck, shouting,
"The devil is dead, the devil is dead, our work is done, the devil is dead."
They later learned that Tamafainga had held despotic spiritual and temporal power because he was believed to be an incarnation of evil spirits. Adopted by a great chief in his infancy, he was considered so sacred that he was not tattooed. Although he owned little property, all the chiefs paid him homage, believing that the spirit of the devil resided in him and that he had the power to inflict disease and death at his will. He was consulted as an oracle on all occasions, and since some of his predictions had been fulfilled, he was held in great esteem. As an example of Tamafainga's shrewd guessing, or whatever his gift may have been, it is said that a trading canoe once kidnapped a young woman instead of a runaway slave. Tamafainga comforted the distraught parents by predicting that a foul wind would blow the kidnappers back the next day, and when this happened, he gained even more glory, likely due to his weather wisdom. However, we are not told how many times his predictions may have failed. Accompanied by a bodyguard of 6 wild young men, Tamafainga travelled through Samoa, his companions engaging in robbery and destruction, driven by mischief and pure wickedness. Finally, an act of extreme atrocity, too horrible to describe here, enraged the people of Upolu so much that they killed this monstrous figure of wickedness. Though the chiefs were not sorry to be rid of the oppressive tyranny under which they and their people had suffered, the system of blood revenge and the necessity of securing their own authority compelled them to avenge Tamafainga's death. Malietoa, the king, was already at war with the murderers when the messenger of peace anchored at Sapapalii, his capital. His brother Tamalelangi immediately sent a message, requesting the king's return, and while awaiting his arrival, Tamalelangi worked hard to welcome the missionaries. Fowea, now among his own people, passionately encouraged them to warmly receive both the strangers and their message. With Fowea's support, the natives became so familiar with the missionaries that they began to inspect their clothing. In doing so, one of them removed Mr. Williams's shoe, and to their astonishment, the Samoans thought the white chief had no toes. This strange discovery was whispered to Fowea, who immediately explained that the white man wore clothes on his feet, which the Samoans quickly verified. Fowea then performed another service for the missionaries. When Tamalangi sent coconuts, pigs, and bananas to the ship for sale, Fowea informed the chief that the messenger of peace was a praying vessel. Upon hearing this, Tamalangi refused to accept payment for the food he had sent. Inspired by this generosity, the missionaries decided to land, and 8 men, along with their wives and children, went ashore.
Meanwhile, those remaining on the ship witnessed thick columns of smoke and flames rising from Upolu, where Malietoa was avenging Tamafainga's death. At the same time, his brother at Sapapalihi was welcoming the ministers of the gospel of peace and goodwill. Later that evening, Malietoa himself arrived from the battlefield and came aboard the ship. While speaking with the white chiefs, Mr. Williams experienced yet another remarkable deliverance from death. Malietoa picked up a brass blunderbuss, previously loaded by the captain with 8 bullets, and after examining the weapon, pointed it at Mr. Williams, ready to pull the trigger. The captain rushed into the cabin, just in time to prevent the king from firing. Once again, God had intervened to save his servant, who, like all of us, was immortal until his work was done. The next day, after sunset, Mr. Williams and Mr. Bath went ashore, where they were met by a massive crowd. Some carried lighted torches, while others, more timid, climbed into the trees, Zacchaeus-like, to catch a glimpse of the strange visitors. As Mr. Williams grew tired, he and his companion were lifted and carried for half a mile, then safely deposited before Malietoa, who warmly welcomed them and invited them to stay with him. However, the missionaries chose to spend their time with the teachers, who were soon to be left alone in Samoa, and therefore went to the house Tamalangi had provided for them. Though not in the proper sequence of events, an amusing story from Mr. Williams' journal is worth recounting. During his stay in Samoa, 6 or 8 vampire bats were captured, and as the missionaries were unfamiliar with their habits, they hung the bats by their hind legs from a string in the ship's cabin. When the light went out, the bats began to explore their surroundings, and one of them fell into a barrel of treacle. Using its claws, it managed to escape. But what followed is best described in Mr. Williams's own words.
His companions, attracted by his superior sweetness, began licking him. Annoyed by their furious licking, he took off, moving as fast as his claws could carry him. The others gave chase, and they all ran into my brother missionary's bed. He awoke to find all these creatures crawling over him. It was useless to try to shake them off, as their beaks held onto the clothes so tightly. To remove them by hand seemed too risky, as they are angry little creatures and use their teeth effectively. Hearing the commotion, I asked what was happening. He replied, "All these little devils are coming to my cabin to torment me." When we finally got a light, we had a good laugh at our friend's expense, for in addition to seeing 6 or 8 black imps sprawled over the bed, we also saw treacle smeared everywhere, as the bats continued to chase and lick the unfortunate sweet one who fought them off furiously. After witnessing this display of their tormenting abilities, we banished them from the cabin.
From Mr. Williams's journal, we extract a recipe for what he calls
a good substitute for a hot cup of tea or a basin of gruel.
This Samoan delicacy, he explains, is made from the young coconut.
The young nut, when about 1/4 of an inch thick on the shell, is soft. This is scraped out and squeezed between the hands until it is broken into very small pieces. The water from the coconut is then poured into a wooden bowl with the scraped coconut, and hot stones are added. It is then served in coconut shell cups. I had it for breakfast every morning and grew to like it very much. The chiefs generally have it very early.
He also notes,
They make soups from fish, boiling them in leaves, as they do not have the art of making fireproof earthenware like the Fiji Indians.
Before continuing the narrative, it's worth noting a unique form of mourning practiced by Samoan women. They were marked with dark patches forming designs, a look achieved by twisting a piece of native cloth, setting it on fire, and briefly touching the skin with the flame. This caused a blister, and when healed, the skin was darker. These dark patches were considered pleasing to the eye. Such customs reveal the vanity among the natives, as evidenced by the fact that a large hog was eagerly traded for 6 large blue beads used for personal adornment. Returning to the story, the morning after Mr. Williams landed, a public meeting was held to discuss his proposals. Following custom, Mr. Williams presented gifts to both Malietoa and his brother, Tamalilangi. In an act of unexpected generosity, Tamalilangi handed nearly all of his gifts to Malietoa. Though clearly pleased by his brother's kindness, the king declined to accept the goods from his hands. Both royal brothers promised to protect the teachers, and the missionaries were delighted with their warm reception from the people. Before departing from Samoa, Mr. Williams was visited by Matatau, the imposing chief of Manono. Matatau requested a teacher for his island, declaring that once he had one, he would make his people place themselves under instruction. Mr. Williams agreed to bring a teacher on his next visit, but advised the chief to lead by example rather than coercion, as the use of force was contrary to the gospel. After transporting Matatau back to his island, and, with Malietoa, returning to Upolu, the messenger of peace set sail from Samoa. Reflecting on the events of this memorable voyage, Mr. Williams beautifully observed,
There are 2 little words in our language that I have always admired: try and trust. You do not know what you can or cannot accomplish until you try. And if you make your attempts with trust in God, mountains of imaginary difficulty will vanish as you approach them, and opportunities will arise that you never anticipated.
Indeed, these words could well serve as the motto of his life. By trying, he achieved far more than he ever expected, and by trusting in God, he secured further opportunities for service. After leaving Samoa, Mr. Williams attempted to return to Savage Island to drop off the 2 natives he had brought from there. However, contrary winds made this impossible, and the messenger of peace proceeded to Rarotonga. Upon arriving, they were overjoyed to find that the plague, which had been rampant during their previous visit, had now subsided. They spent several happy days on the island, and among other friends, Mr. Williams met Butive, the cripple. During the pestilence, Butive had bravely confronted a war party, pleading for peace and urging them not to disrupt the peace brought by the gospel. Despite threats to his life, Butive continued to speak boldly, declaring that though they might spear him, they could not spear God, who would conquer them.
This God has now most effectually done, and Rarotonga is again Rarotonga.
Reluctantly, the voyagers resumed their journey and soon reached Tahiti. At Amio, the mission settlement, the Christians gathered to hear an account of the voyage. One old chief was so moved by the report of what had been accomplished in Samoa that he urged the missionaries to continue their good work. Not long afterward, this chief passed away, saying to his friends as he died, "The blood of Jesus is my foundation. Jesus is the best king. He gives a pillow without thorns." After receiving hearty congratulations from their friends, the messenger of peace safely returned to Raiatea. Soon after Mr. Williams arrived in Raiatea, he was called to the deathbed of me, a poor old blind man who had become one of the trophies of divine grace.
Mi had once been a renowned warrior and a terror to all the inhabitants of Raiatea during his heathen days. However, ever since Mr. Williams' first arrival, Mi had faithfully attended the means of grace. It was with great sorrow that Mr. Williams bade him farewell.
I saw an immense mountain,
Mi told his friend,
with steep sides, and I tried to climb it. But after reaching a considerable height, I lost my hold and fell to the bottom. Exhausted and in despair, I sat down to weep. While I was weeping, I saw a drop of blood fall upon the mountain, and in a moment the mountain dissolved. That mountain was my sins, and the drop was one drop of the precious blood of Jesus, which alone could melt away the mountain of my guilt.
In this faith and confidence, Mi soon passed away. Mr. Williams, moved by the scene, later said,
I retired from that overwhelming and touching moment, praying that my end might be like his.
How little we know of what is to come. Too full of faith to anticipate trouble, it seemed now as if it was God's will that Mr. Williams should return to England. His wife became gravely ill, and her life was despaired of. Still, Mr. Williams was eager to complete his translation of the New Testament into Rarotongan before leaving the South Seas. He gathered the natives and explained his distressing circumstances. The people were so deeply grieved at the thought of even a temporary separation that Mr. Williams agreed to remain at Raiatea, provided his wife's health improved. Contrary to all expectations, she did recover, and Mr. Williams was able to stay through the turbulent times that followed in Raiatea. Trouble arose primarily from the threat of war. Many years earlier, a chief named Tapoa had conquered Raiatea and the nearby islands. Now, his grandson, also named Tapoa, claimed the same supremacy his grandfather once held and threatened to enforce his claim by arms. The anxieties caused by this looming conflict hastened the death of Tamatoa, the elderly king of Raiatea. On his deathbed, he warned his people,
"Beware, lest the gospel be driven from these islands."
To Mr. Williams, he said,
"My dear friend, how long we have labored together in this good cause. Nothing has ever separated us. Now death is doing what nothing else could. But who shall separate us from the love of Christ?"
Every effort was made to persuade Tapoa II to abandon his plans, which also involved the re-establishment of idolatry under his protection. The Raiateans, encouraged by their teachers, prepared to defend their homes and faith. Despite the personal danger, one of Tapoa's followers even attempted to kill him, Mr. Williams did everything he could to promote peace. He eventually persuaded the chiefs of Tahiti to intervene, and their mediation brought about an agreement that seemed to avert the war. With the conflict seemingly avoided, and with Mr. and Mrs. Smith arriving to take over his station, Mr. Williams decided to visit Rarotonga once more. The messenger of peace left Raiatea and arrived at Rarotonga 7 days later. After a brief stay, Mr. Williams took Mr. Buzzacott on a visit to various islands in the Hervey group. Mr. Buzzacott was particularly struck by how warmly the natives received Mr. Williams, saying, "The natives clung around him. He seemed to be one with them." Mr. Williams narrowly escaped death. While attempting to row from the shore to the ship, the boat was dashed against the reef, and he was pulled under the water. 2 natives, seeing his peril, rescued him, marking the 6th time he had been saved from drowning. Full of devout gratitude for his preservation, Mr. Williams returned to Rarotonga, where he focused on completing his translation of the scriptures. His work was first interrupted by the discovery of a plot to reinstate tattooing and other heathen practices. Shortly after this plot was suppressed, a greater disaster struck Rarotonga, a violent hurricane. The storm destroyed nearly 1,000 houses and uprooted many trees across the island. The messenger of peace was swept several miles inland by a massive wave, breaking branches 12 to 13 feet above the ground, before being deposited in a hole about 5 feet deep.
If not for a grove of large chestnut trees, which halted the boat's progress, it would have sunk into a nearby bog. During the storm, Mrs. Williams narrowly escaped death when the wall of the house collapsed onto her bed moments after she had left it. Tragically, a few days later, she buried another infant who had died as a result of the storm. A touching moment occurred during this time of bereavement. As the coffin was about to be closed, little Samuel, then about 4 years old, cried out,
"Father! Mother! Why do you plant my little brother? Don't plant him! I cannot bear to have him planted!"
The hurricane that caused so much destruction was viewed differently by the natives. Some bitterly complained that it was the worst of 5 calamities to befall them since the arrival of Christianity, and, disillusioned, they reverted to their former ways. Others, however, wisely saw the disaster as a call to repentance and took comfort in the fact that they still had the Bible. Mr. Williams, ever resourceful, encouraged the people to repair the damage caused by the storm by distributing axes and other tools. However, as troubles tend to come in clusters, he discovered that a cask of oil needed for making chunam, a material used instead of copper to protect the bottom of the vessel from worms and to make it watertight, had leaked. The loss of 180 gallons of oil was due to a thief who, after taking some, failed to reinsert the spile, allowing the rest to drain away. This vital loss could not be replaced. Meanwhile, some natives stole the mission's best boat and fled to sea. Burdened by these various misfortunes, it took months of hard labour before the messenger of peace could be extricated from the hole it had sunk into during the storm and carried back to the ocean. Finally, after repairs to the damage sustained by the ship, it was refloated, and Mr. Williams set out for Tahiti to procure provisions for the Rarotongans, whose food crops had been destroyed by the hurricane. Upon arriving in Tahiti, Mr. Williams received troubling news from Raiatea. A cask of spirits purchased from a trading vessel had incited such a thirst for alcohol that nearly 20 stills were soon operating on the island. The consequence was disastrous. Almost the entire population had become drunkards, with fewer than 100 people remaining sober. Mr. Williams, a man of decisive action, immediately travelled to Raiatea. Through his earnest appeals, he persuaded the people to dismantle the stills and form a temperance society. With this victory achieved, he returned to Rarotonga, bringing with him barrels of flour and other food items purchased from an American captain. He also introduced several animals previously unknown on the island, including horses, donkeys, and horned cattle. The natives were astounded by these creatures and gave them amusing names. The horse was called the Great Pig that Carries Man, the dog became the Barking Pig, and the donkey was known as the Noisy or Long-Eared Pig. Although the missionaries' primary goal was spiritual, the introduction of these animals and provisions greatly benefited the people of Rarotonga. In doing so, Mr. Williams and his team followed the example of Christ, who spent much of his ministry healing diseases and meeting the physical needs of the poor. It raises the question of whether neglecting this aspect of Christ's ministry is a significant hindrance to the success of the church in modern times. Chapter 6. A Wanderer with Many Homes. From 1832 to 1834. Milton said, "I, on the other side, used no ambition to commend my deeds. The deeds themselves, though mute, spoke loud the doer." Thomas Fuller said, "Some men, like a tiled house, are long before they take fire, but once in flame, there is no coming near to quench them." Having now supplied the temporal necessities of his friends in Rarotonga, Mr. Williams prepared for his second voyage to Samoa. Makea, the king of Rarotonga, resolved to accompany him on this expedition. At sunset, therefore, on the 11th of October, 1832, the messenger of peace set sail with a fair wind. The king was in high spirits, though his friends wept much as they bid him farewell. Following Tuesday, after leaving Rarotonga Tiava, a convert from Mr. Buzzacot's church offered a remarkable prayer, which Mr. Williams recorded in full in his Enterprises. Afterwards, Tiava asked, "Why does David in the Psalms speak so much about Jehovah, while Paul in his epistles primarily talks about Jesus Christ, yet both were inspired men?" Mr. Williams explained the difference between the Old and New dispensations to resolve his concern. The voyage itself had no other notable incidents, and on the 17th, at daybreak, after covering 800 miles in 5 days, they sighted Manua, the most easterly of the Samoan islands. Mr. Williams had determined to visit every island in the Samoan group during this voyage, so they headed towards Manua, and by 9 o'clock they were near the shore. Although Manua was 250 miles from Sapapalia, where the native teachers resided, several visitors who boarded the vessel introduced themselves as Sons of the Word. Among them were natives of Rivave, who had drifted far from their homeland many years ago. Being Christians, they had built a chapel in this foreign land. On the opposite side of the island, Mr. Williams found more Christians. At Ososenga, the next island visited, the chief came aboard with an English boy who had run away from a whaling ship. The chief earnestly requested powder and muskets, but when denied these, he begged Mr. Williams to come ashore. However, as Mr. Williams was eager to reach Savai before Sunday, he declined the invitation and continued to Te Tuila. The natives there were extremely wild, but their paddling skills were so expert that they kept up with the ship. In one of these canoes was an Englishman named William Gray, from whom Mr. Williams learned of another man who, according to Gray,
was always reading his Bible and turning men to religion.
Gray himself had shared his views with the natives by saying,
"It's all one to me whether they worship our God or their own. It's only another name."
After sending an encouraging message to the Te Tuilan Cornelius, Mr. Williams continued along the coast. In one district, they found 50 people who had renounced idolatry and built a small chapel for worship. The local chief begged for a teacher, promising to become a Christian himself if only a worker of religion would come to live with him.
I regularly travel to the native teachers to get some religion, which I bring carefully home and give to the people. When that is gone, I take my canoe again and fetch some more. Give me a man full of religion, so I may not risk my life going such a distance to fetch it.
Mr. Williams promised to bring a teacher, this worker of religion, on his next visit and returned to the ship, much encouraged. There, he found another chief from a neighbouring valley waiting for him. This chief and his people had also become nominal Christians. As proof of his knowledge, the chief placed his hands together in the shape of a book, recited a chapter from a spelling book, and knelt on the deck to pray in a mixture of Samoan and Tahitian. After leaving these interesting people, with a promise to visit them again, Mr. Williams continued on to Upolu, where Tamawhainga had been killed. There, he encountered 2 runaway English sailors who proudly shared their efforts in turning people religious. One of them boasted,
"I does a great deal for these people, sir. I've been 9 miles today to see a sick man. I reads a chapter and a prayer over them, and when they get well, they generally turns religious."
Misunderstanding Mr. Williams's silence, the sailor further bragged that after reading over one sick man,
"The pain moved to another part of the body, and after a second reading, the man recovered. I even cured a white swelling of the knee through these readings."
Mr. Williams warned these men against their misguided practices, but encouraged them to share whatever true knowledge they had with the people. He found that these sailors had many imitators, and from their influence, a sect had emerged throughout the islands, based on a distorted version of Christianity. Saturday, the 20th, the messenger of peace reached the settlement of Malietoa. The king was absent, engaged in his favourite pastime of pigeon catching, At first, Mr. Williams stayed with the king's brother, but remembering the extreme jealousy of the natives, he later moved to the king's house. The next day was Sunday, and in the morning, a congregation of 700 gathered in the chapel. The singing was not congregational, as the women had used the hymns at their indelicate dances, so only the teachers sang. Mr. Williams described the congregation as the wildest he had ever seen. Some of the chiefs wore mats draped over their shoulders or tied around their waists, and their hair stood in various styles, some stiff and erect like hedgehog prickles, others with frizzy hair that made their heads appear large, and some with their hair arranged in large round top knots. The women appeared even more savage, but they were so content with their attire that they frequently invited the teachers' wives to dress in the Samoan style, saying, "It will attract all the handsome young men of the town." Mr. Williams would humorously remark that the teachers' wives had not yet adopted the fashions of the Samoan ladies. After the service, around 1 o'clock, the king arrived. He greeted the visitors warmly and shared that his heart was Manau Tasilava ite lotu a Jehovah, meaning single in its desire to know Jehovah. Following the afternoon service, one of the native teachers addressed the crowd.
Mono tasilava ite lotu a Jehovah,
meaning
single in its desire to know Jehovah.
Following the afternoon service, one of the native teachers addressed the crowd.
Friends, for a long time now, some of you have ridiculed and reproached us. You have called us deceivers and spoken evil against us. Here is our minister, Mr. Williams, whom you said you would wait for. You can now ask him any questions you have regarding the truth of what we have told you. Furthermore, some of you have followed an impostor who taught you to observe Saturday as the sacred day. You rejected us and took advice from an ignorant and wicked man. Mr. Williams comes from the foundation of truth, England. He, along with his fellow missionaries, is the source of all true knowledge in these seas. Now, ask him about all the points where you have doubted our words. He is our root.
No one responded to the teacher's challenge, and after a brief silence, the king stood and said,
The teachers should not be concerned about what ignorant or insignificant individuals have said. Let everyone, from this time, put away all suspicions and ill feelings. Surely you all now see the truth of what you have heard. Let all Savai'i and Upolu embrace this great religion. The Samoan people are very simple to have listened to what a stinking pig had to say about religion, or to observe a stinking pig's Sabbath. As for me, my whole heart is devoted to the word of Jehovah, and I will do my utmost to see that the word of Jehovah encircles the land.
After the chief's speech, Mr. Williams asked one of the teachers to inform the people that he would meet with them the next day to answer any questions they had. In the evening of the same day, Mr. Williams preached to nearly 1,000 people. While the teachers were conducting family worship in different households after the service, he composed 3 hymns for Samoan use. One of these hymns, along with his own translation, is presented here as a sample of his poetic ability.
Great is his compassion, his mercy upon us. Great the love of Jesus Christ to die upon the earth. A beloved son was Jesus Christ, a very good son. But he died here below to obtain salvation for us. Let us everyone believe with our whole hearts that our soul may obtain salvation when Jesus Christ shall come.
The next morning, Malietoa tried to bring the messenger of peace into the lagoon to keep his visitors, but fortunately, the plan was discovered before any damage could be done to the ship. Although this attempt failed, during the public meeting held that Monday, Malietoa declared his intention to forsake war and protect any white missionaries who might settle at Sowing.
My one desire is to know, love, and serve Jehovah.
When Mr. Williams expressed confidence in his sincerity, the old king clasped his hands and said,
Oh, how fearfully wise these people are.
After the meeting, Mr. Williams spoke with the teachers about their experiences during his absence. They shared that at first they faced severe sickness, which lasted for some time. Later, the king's son and brother began attending their meetings. However, the war, fought to avenge Tamafanga's death, significantly hindered their work. Once the war ended, the king himself embraced Christianity. Initially, he suggested that his sons continue the old worship until he was sure there was no danger in embracing the gospel.
If I die, or things go ill with me, you still have your spirits, which you have not abandoned.
Although his sons did not openly oppose him, they secretly ate their itu, a type of fish in which their god's spirit was believed to reside. As they transitioned from idolatry, they took the precaution of drinking scented oil, believing it would protect them from the spirits. Eventually, they publicly declared their conversion, and as a national rejection of heathenism, the god of war, symbolized by a piece of rotten matting, was sentenced to destruction. Initially, they planned to burn it, but deciding this would be too cruel, they instead drowned the matting. Malietoa further demonstrated the depth of his new faith by refusing to engage in war, even when provoked by the people of Manono, who attempted to instigate conflict and even conspired against his life. Mr. Williams was pleased with the teachers, to whom he credited this transformation, and to assist them in their evangelistic efforts, he helped them construct a boat. One significant challenge they faced was the natives' natural indolence, which made teaching them to read nearly impossible. The Samoans struggled to apply themselves to learning the alphabet, often exclaiming after only a few minutes, "Oh, how tired I am, put it away." One native humorously justified his ignorance by saying, "Writing, good for captain, but Samoan more clever and can retain things in his head and does not need writing." Nevertheless, Mr. Williams encouraged the teachers to persevere, recommending they use a catechism to strengthen the people's memory and impart useful knowledge. The Samoans' ingenuity was evident in an incident recorded by Mr. Williams in his journal. One morning, while the mission party was preparing to salt and scald hogs to provision the messenger of peace, they found themselves without a pot large enough to boil water. Unsure of what to do, the natives heated red-hot stones and placed them into a large trough of water, quickly bringing it to a boil. Like the egg of Columbus, it was a simple solution, though no one had thought of it before. On Wednesday, the 24th, Mr. Williams visited Amoa, a settlement about 8 miles from Malietoa's capital. There, he met 2 young chiefs who had built a chapel for themselves, as all their subjects were nominal Christians. In Amoa, he also encountered a remarkable woman who, after becoming a Christian, took an active role in teaching other women. Through her efforts, nearly 100 women had embraced Christianity. Mr. Williams describes his meeting with this remarkable woman as follows.
I was interrupted by the appearance of a line of females following each other in a goose-like procession. There were about 70 of them, each carrying something in her hand. They entered the house where I sat and placed before me a baked pig, taro, coconuts, and other items. The chief woman then addressed me.
I have just heard that you had come up to this settlement, and I feared you might not reach as far as my home. So I gathered the Christian women together and have come to pay my respects to you, as the chief to whom I owe the knowledge of Jehovah. Our offering is small, for none of our husbands have yet become sons of the word.
Mr. Williams learned that this woman regularly gathered knowledge from the teachers and then returned to her settlement to share it with others. When her knowledge ran out, she would return to the teachers and stay with them for a week or two to learn more. This woman had successfully persuaded between 70 and 100 women to become Christians, though she had not yet convinced their husbands to follow suit. Mr. Williams noted,
had adorned themselves with as much care as ladies in England do when meeting someone they highly respect. The chief woman wore a red shaggy mat tied around her waist, which reached halfway to her knees. One corner was tucked up to expose her left thigh almost to the hip. Her body was anointed with scented oil, which made her skin shine brightly in the sun. She was further adorned with orange-coloured rouge, prepared from turmeric, liberally applied under her arms and across her chest. She wore a necklace of large blue beads and matching bracelets around her wrists. Her head was shaved, except for a small tuft of hair no larger than a crown piece, with a lock of hair about 6 or 7 inches long hanging over her left brow. Some of her companions were clearly women of rank, as indicated by the white mats they wore, but all were adorned with blue beads, which they prized as English ladies do pearls and diamonds.
However, the time had come for Mr. Williams to leave Samoa. Due to the ongoing enmity between the chief of Manono and Malietoa, which threatened the mission, the messenger of peace was sent to Manono with an invitation for the chief to visit Malietoa. When the chief refused, Mr. Williams persuaded Malietoa to accompany him to Manono. Malietoa brought several of his wives along, and they were so impressed by the softness of the pillows and sheets that they wanted to take over the missionary's cabin and bed for themselves. Upon arriving in Manono, Mr. Williams successfully brought the two chiefs together and reconciled them. Malietoa expressed his deep desire for the word of Jehovah and vowed never to engage in war again.
I have cast away war. I have trodden it underfoot. I am sick and surfeited with war,
he declared. Both Malietoa and Matata assured Mr. Williams.
We have determined to be of one heart and mind in supporting the religion you have brought us, and we will use our influence in the future to prevent all war.
Near Manono is a small oblong island, accessible only through a narrow channel between two rocks. Mr. Williams likened the island to a basin with a quarter broken off. Should the people of Manono face defeat in battle, they retreat to this island. They throw a bridge across the chasm from which they hurl stones at their attackers, while a tripping line is laid along the water, ensuring that any canoe entering the passage is wrecked. These people are known as Malo, meaning victorious, and they keep a curious stone register of their wars. After each victory, they place a uniquely shaped stone in a large basket. Just before Mr. Williams' visit, the basket contained 197 stones. Since the Malo had never been aggressors in any conflict, the register highlights the ferocity of the South Sea Islanders. The messenger of peace was nearly wrecked while passing this island. As the ship was weathering the point, the wind suddenly died, and a strong current began to carry the vessel helplessly towards towering cliffs, where the waves crashed violently against the rocky walls. However, providentially, a breeze sprang up just in time, saving the ship from smashing into the cliffs. After escaping this danger, the missionary party encountered several other difficulties before finally finding a safe harbour at Apia. Here, they were surrounded by natives who were eager to obtain tin for making pipes.
Something they had learned from our Scottish countrymen, Mr. Williams notes with dismay,
as they had introduced the locals to the harmful use of tobacco. Unable to get tin, the natives attempted to steal copper from the ship's sternpost, but they were caught and forced to keep their canoes at a respectful distance.
The next day, the party landed and observed a curious local custom. The women of Apia plastered their hair with lime, which burned it and gave it a brownish tint that they seemed to favour. The chief of Apia professed to be a Christian, and around 80 of his people had also embraced the faith. While praying with them, Mr. Williams remarked,
Never did I feel more bitterly the evil of Babel's confusion than when I was obliged, on this interesting occasion, to pray in the Rarotongan tongue.
After departing from Apia, the messenger of peace stopped at Keppel's Island, where the missionaries encountered the widow of Puna, a former teacher at Rurutu. Mr. Williams recorded in his journal,
The poor woman sent her 2 children to meet me and guide me to the hut where she was living. Native-like, she clung to my legs and wept aloud for a long time.
On Keppel's Island, they also learned of a teacher who called himself Samuel. Through his influence, half of the island's 500 inhabitants had become Christians. With Poona's widow and her children on board, the voyage continued. After being becalmed for 2 days, the crew became alarmed on Sunday evening, November 11th, when they realised that half an hour of pumping was no longer enough to clear the water from the ship. Normally, it took only 7 minutes to accomplish this. Upon investigation, they discovered that a water cask containing 130 gallons had a hole bored into it, and the plug had been forgotten. However, this did not fully explain the amount of water in the hold. After pumping the ship dry, the crew decided to remain stationary until morning. Around 4 o'clock, the mate woke Mr. Williams to report 3 feet of water in the hold. After 2.5 hours of vigorous pumping, the ship was again dry. But they found that one pump needed to be constantly in operation to keep the ship from taking on more water. Despite their best efforts, they could not locate the source of the leak. By evening, they prepared for the worst, placing 2 bags of biscuits and some coconuts near the boats and canoe, in case they needed to abandon ship quickly. Mr. Williams wrote in his journal,
"Thus, a day of consternation, anxiety, and distress has passed over me, such as I never experienced. I have been enabled, however, to maintain entire composure and to make all arrangements with the utmost coolness. It is to all appearances a frown in Providence, but a smile and face may one day be seen behind it."
That night, while listening to the pumps and unable to sleep, he mentally traced over every plank, seam, and bulkhead in the vessel, from stem to stern, convinced that nothing could have given way. Adding to their troubles, a strong headwind arose. Despite this, by working the pumps for 7 minutes every half hour, they managed to keep the water under control. To their great relief, on Friday, the 16th, they reached Vavo, where Wesleyan missionaries were stationed. They had much difficulty finding a safe anchorage, but at 10 o'clock they reached the beach, and Mr. Williams went ashore to see if the missionaries had any letters for Tonga. Micaiah, always eager to visit a place where a missionary resided, accompanied him.
"He is always ready to go ashore where a missionary resides, but he does not like to trust himself on shore where no missionary has been."
When they arrived at the mission premises, they were surprised to find the natives all armed, some with spears, others with clubs, and still others with guns.
"From whose mouth issues fire, brimstone, and smoke."
Mr. Turner, the local missionary, was away working on the mission house, so Mr. Williams went to find him. The 2 missionaries quickly became close friends and enjoyed a pleasant evening in each other's company.
"I was happy to find that nearly all the inhabitants of Vava'u have embraced Christianity. The congregation on Sabbath days numbers 2,000 or 3,000 people. Although they have erected a large chapel, Mr. Turner says it is not nearly big enough for the needs of the converts."
About 200 of these worshippers met in class, and 800 others were candidates for baptism. This remarkable progress had been achieved in just 4 months. Reflecting on this, Mr. Williams wrote,
"I felt considerable interest in hearing about the mission's progress at Vava'u, for when we last saw King Finau 2 years ago, he was determined to oppose the gospel. He even threatened to put to death any man, woman, or child who embraced Christianity. It could not have been anticipated that in such a short time he himself, along with every person on his island, would accept the religion he had so strongly opposed. But such is often the way of God. A blessing is often near when it seems far away."
Mr. Williams asked Mrs. Turner if she found the isolation difficult. He remarked that he couldn't imagine how she could content herself in such a remote place. She replied,
"It is indeed trying, but my only desire is to be where the Lord would have me be. If this is his will, I believe I can reconcile myself to any place, however lonely.
This response, so in tune with the questioner's own sentiments, was all the more remarkable considering the challenges the missionaries faced. At times, they lacked basic supplies and even had to purchase water by the coconut shell. The local people were not particularly generous toward the missionaries, refusing to perform any service unless they were paid well for it. This absence of courtesy and kindness added to the hardships the missionaries endured. The missionaries were therefore reluctant to see their visitors leave and strongly urged them to stay, at least over Sunday. However, the longing to return home, which Mr. Williams admitted now filled his heart, prevented him from accepting the invitation. Mrs. Turner, understanding this feeling due to her own isolation, asked Mr. Williams how long he had been away from home.
How long have you been away from home?
Nearly 12 weeks.
How can your poor wife endure such loneliness among savage people?
Mrs. Turner asked sympathetically.
I will not press you to stay even a day longer with us, for it would be cruel to do so. I know how I would feel if Mr. Turner were absent.
Since the waters were calm, some natives were employed to dive beneath the vessel and thoroughly examine the hull, while the interior of the ship was also carefully inspected, with the cabin floor taken up. Despite their efforts, the leak could not be found. At 11 o'clock, the party departed from Vava'u and sailed on to Tonga, also known as Tongatabu, which means sacred Tonga. Vava'u itself was less a single island, and more a collection of small, rocky crags, habitable only in the little bays that occasionally broke through the cliffs.
It is the most dreary place imaginable. The tall, barren rocks shut in the people, and the general barrenness, along with the deathly stillness, except for the fierce sounds of the sea, crashing at the base of the cliffs, make life there a terrible trial.
Unfortunately, a strong headwind delayed their progress, so what should have been a 24-hour voyage to Tonga stretched into 6 days. All this time, the leak in the vessel remained undiscovered and unstopped. After 12 days of battling water in the ship, they were relieved to find an English ship at Tonga. Unlike Vava'u, Tonga is flat, with its shoreline unbroken by mountain scenery. In 1796, a group of 10 missionaries had landed there. 3 were cruelly murdered, and the survivors only escaped with their lives by hiding until a ship arrived, allowing them to flee. For a time, Tonga was without missionaries. As in other places, opposition to the missionaries was led by a renegade Englishman, an escaped convict in this instance. He convinced the king that the missionaries were wizards responsible for an epidemic that was raging at the time, claiming their enchantments caused the disease. The Tongans' houses are oval in shape, with rounded ends indicating their primitive nature. Miss Gordon Cumming described these structures, noting,
"They have the same deep thatch as the Fijian houses, generally made of reeds from the wild sugarcane. The walls are constructed from plaited cocoa palm leaves or interwoven foliage. Unlike Fijian homes, Tongan houses lack a stone foundation to elevate them above the damp earth, and many of the poorer huts have floors merely strewn with dried grass, in contrast to the neat mats found even in the poorest Fijian homes. Only in the wealthier homes did we see coarse mats made from Pandorus. However, most houses had an inner room sectioned off as a separate sleeping area. We also noticed that the Tongan pillow closely resembles that of Fiji, being merely a piece of bamboo supported by 2 legs. Cooking is usually done in a separate hut, built over an underground oven, although many ovens are out in the open, and the daily yams or pigs for special occasions are baked quite publicly.
A boat came out to the messenger of peace, and the young man in charge informed Mr. Williams that Raiatea was once again under the threat of war. With the reefs around Tonga being very dangerous and unfamiliar to him, Mr. Williams handed the vessel over to the pilot and set off in an open boat for the shore. It took them nearly 5 hours to land, but the warm welcome they received from their missionary brethren soon made them forget their fatigue. That evening, Mr. Williams learned of some dissension between Christian men, which led him to remark,
How numerous are the enemies that Satan raises against the good work of the Lord, both at home and abroad, both among its professed friends and from other quarters.
After a night's rest, Mr. Williams went out in the boat to search for the ship. However, she was nowhere to be seen, and as the wind was blowing hard, they decided to land on a small island. There, they found a large water snake with 30 to 40 young ones curled together. They killed the mother and some of the young, bringing them back to the boat. The large snake measured 3 feet 6 inches in length and was as thick as a lady's wrist. When they laid the skin on the rocks to dry, the island's natives became upset, claiming that they had killed their god. After some time, the situation calmed, though they still threatened the mischievous man seen holding the snakeskin. Despite this, Mr. Williams grew increasingly anxious when the ship remained out of sight. He feared the peril of returning to Rarotonga without Micaiah, but by noon the ship was spotted and they reboarded.
Everything was turned upside down. The spirit case was upset, and all the bottles were broken. The spirits had soaked into my clothes bag. The oil was spilled, the barrels were broken, and there was much other damage to repair.
With the help of Captain Henry, who had accompanied Mr. Williams from the shore, the ship was safely brought within the reef. Mr. Williams was deeply moved when he saw the spot where Mr. Cross, one of the missionaries, had drowned for lack of a proper boat. The following day was Saturday, and it was decided that repairs would begin on Monday to locate the leak. The captain of another vessel who had recently arrived and had himself run aground near Vava'u the previous year offered his assistance, which was gratefully accepted. Understanding their troubles firsthand, he was able to sympathize with them. With this matter settled, the King of Tonga invited Micaiah for a visit, which he accepted. Micaiah was received with great ceremony, seated beside the king, with a baked pig and a basket of yams placed before him. The pig was lifted into full view of the semicircle of chiefs gathered around, and a native orator gave thanks on Micaiah's behalf, inviting him to feel at home in Tonga. A large root of kava was then presented to the group, and acknowledged by the orator. He instructed the people to prepare the kava, which they did by chewing pieces of the root. After being well masticated, the root was placed into a wooden bowl and water was added. The mixture was strained through fibrous bark or grass, and the kava was ready. The officiating person filled a cup and cried, "The cup is full," then announced the name of the person to whom it would be given. The recipient clapped their hands, producing a hollow sound as a response. The orator amusingly called his own name first, clapped his hands, and only by the third cup did he call out the king's name. Micaiah was then offered the kava, and after him, Mr. Williams was invited, though he declined to drink it.
I determined, being fond of experiments, to try my powers of mastication upon the root. I chose a small piece from the heart of the root, but before it had been in my mouth for half a minute, I was glad to spit it out again. It was extremely bitter and produced a great discharge of saliva.
The Tongans had a hearty laugh at Mr. Williams and remarked,
"The white men are clever at most things, but not at chewing kava."
The next day was the Sabbath, and Mr. Williams was delighted to see nearly 600 natives gather for divine worship. He was especially impressed by the quality of their singing, which was exceptional for this station.
It has often astonished me that so little attention is given to this art in our missionary seminaries. It seems not to occur to missionaries and those responsible for their training, that the heathen will depend on them not only for the creation of hymns, but also for learning how to sing the praises of God. Therefore, it is necessary to direct the missionary student's attention to the rules of poetic composition as well as to singing.
On Monday, all valuable items were removed from the ship and placed in the mission house for safekeeping. A friend more experienced in such matters took charge of the necessary arrangements, allowing Mr. Williams to spend time with the brethren stationed in Tonga. Meanwhile,
2 English captains, whose ships were in the harbour, assisted in heaving the messenger of peace down. They discovered that an auger hole, into which a bolt had not been driven, was the source of all their distress. Another hole had been made nearby, but the first one had never been plugged. For nearly 6 months, dirt and stones had filled the hole so well that the messenger of peace had sailed thousands of miles without issue. However, when the carpenter cleared the hole with an auger but failed to plug it, the ship began taking on water again. It was quickly dragged ashore and foundered in shallow water. This new mishap ruined the tea, sugar, salt, and biscuits stored in the cabin, which became pickled together. It took a fortnight of hard work to repair the damage. During this period of delay, the visitors witnessed a native wedding. Both the bride and groom were young, around 20 years old, and dressed in traditional Tongan attire. The bride wore a huge roll of cloth wrapped around her like a belt, creating an enormous protuberance around her body. She needed assistance to stay upright, as it was impossible for her to sit unassisted due to the weight of the cloth. The upper part of her body was bare and covered in so much sweet oil that it made the onlookers' eyes water. The groom was similarly wrapped in multiple layers of mats, and his upper body was also heavily anointed with oil. From the joy of a wedding, Mr. Williams was soon reminded of life's contrasts. After participating in a native prayer meeting, he visited the sacred burial grounds of the chiefs. This expansive enclosure, surrounded by a reed fence, housed several small structures, each sheltering the grave of a chief. The graves, covered with white sand, were meticulously kept free from weeds.
The towering trees, with their rich and varied foliage, provided a welcome shade, and the death-like stillness added a sense of solemnity that you couldn't help but feel as you wandered through the sacred grounds of the dead. The eerie silence was occasionally broken by the screeching of vampire bats, which hung in great numbers from the tops of the trees.
From the cemetery, Mr. Williams visited the home of the living chief, who was not at home upon their arrival. His 6 wives were busily painting a large piece of native cloth, about 15 to 20 yards long and 10 yards wide. The paint was derived from the juices of certain herbs and applied to the fabric by hand. After answering Mr. Williams' questions, the women asked him for some tobacco, a product they were quite fond of. Soon after, the chief returned and invited Mr. Williams to partake of some refreshments. Before eating, the missionary offered a blessing, prompting the chief to ask the interpreter who this visitor was. The interpreter, proud of his role, informed the chief that Mr. Williams was a great chief who had brought the gospel to many islands. He then listed these islands in detail. The chief, impressed, complimented Mr. Williams on his influence and wealth.
How rich you must be, so different from Tanka chiefs who are very poor.
He then asked curiously about what products were made on the various islands visited by the messenger of peace.
Oh, mats, cloth, and nets.
Dear me, those are the very things I most need. Do you have a net to spare for me?
Amused by the chief's direct way of asking for gifts, Mr. Williams replied,
Yes, I have a net to spare. I will send it to you.
Oh no, I will come for it. Do not trouble yourself to send it to me.
However, thinking that if the chief came to the ship, he might notice and ask for other items aboard, Mr. Williams insisted on sending the net instead. A simple gift of a pair of scissors made the chief exceedingly happy. When asked about Christianity, the chief at first dodged the question. When pressed further, he explained that he did not want to be forced to believe in Christ. When the desire to follow him grew naturally in his heart, he would follow the example of others and embrace the gospel. The chief's reluctance was likely due to his unwillingness to renounce the immoral dances of the heathen and to give up his multiple wives. Mr. Williams also observed that the missionaries were fully committed to combating error through literature. They had a large printing press, which, in just over 12 months, had produced 29,100 small books, amounting to a total of 4,772,000 pages. The only criticism Mr. Williams had of the missionaries
was that they had taken on too much manual labour themselves, which he considered unwise in such a harsh climate. On December 5th, he and his party departed from Tonga, arriving in Rarotonga in January 1833. Their voyage had lasted 15 weeks. Mr. Williams now resolved to visit England, and thus he sent the messenger of peace to Tahiti to be sold. He planned to charter a vessel in April to bring his family and himself to Tahiti. However, when no ship arrived, Mr. Williams began to seriously consider building another vessel. An American had previously started constructing a ship, but had not been able to complete it. Mr. Williams purchased the unfinished hull, completed the ship, and sailed it to Tahiti. At Eimeo, he encountered a gentleman named Armitage, who had been sent by the directors to teach the natives how to weave. Leaving his wife and family in the care of Mr. Bath, Mr. Williams returned to Rarotonga with Mr. Armitage. He then journeyed on to Atau, but after landing on this ill-fated island, the ship was blown out to sea and did not return for 3 weeks. Mr. Williams nearly decided to build yet another vessel when, finally, the lost ship came back into sight. He reached Raiatea on October 14th and, after a brief stay, set sail with his family for England. In June 1834, after 18 years of exile, Mr. Williams finally landed on English soil. Chapter 7. A Champion with Many Trophies, 1834 to 1838.
The dearest offering he can crave, his portion in our souls to prove. What is it to the gift he gave, the only son of his dear love?
Everyone should strive to be like to them in grace, that they strive to be equal with in glory.
Dr. Campbell assured Mr. Williams that the years he spent in England were the most productive and important in his life. Wherever he went, he aroused immense enthusiasm, and although the romance of missions has, in some sense, diminished, the effects of his advocacy are still felt today. During his missionary tours, he visited Bristol and met Mary Carpenter, who recorded her opinion of him.
He seems exactly cut out for such a life, having, as far as we could judge, deep and enlarged religious convictions, great benevolence, a gift of tongues, handicraft skill, and some of Brother Martin's homely wisdom and simplicity. He breakfasted with us and made all the young ladies wish to go out to the Society Islands. If I had no tie to England, I should like it very much. Now I think we have enough to do at home, and am very thankful that there are some to do the good works.
To avoid any misunderstanding regarding Mr. Williams's sympathy with some of Mary Carpenter's opinions, it is worth noting that in his unpublished journal he wrote,
"If there is a people against which true Christians may exercise a holy indignation, surely Socinians are that people."
Among other towns, John Williams visited Leeds, where he took part in a missionary meeting at Queen Street Chapel. It is told that there were 2 servants residing in Leeds at that time, one a Wesleyan and the other a careless, indifferent girl. The Wesleyan said to her fellow servant,
"Mr. Williams is coming to Leeds."
"Williams? Who is he? I never heard of him before."
"Oh, he is a famous missionary. He is coming to preach and hold a meeting at Queen Street Chapel. Let us ask for leave to attend."
"Will there be a collection?"
"Of course."
"Well, I will give a penny."
"And I intend to give 6pence.
The 2 servants attended the meeting, and during Mr. Williams' speech, the indifferent girl whispered to her companion,
"Isn't he a wonderful man? Isn't he a wonderful man? I must give half a crown to the collection."
Not only was she moved to this unexpected generosity, but she was so deeply impressed by Mr. Williams's appeal that she was converted and became a member of the church at Queen Street Chapel. Another incident serves as an example of unseen harvests. Mr. Williams' son, the Reverend S.T. Williams, served for several years as co-pastor with the Reverend Thomas Craig. One day, a very charitable lady, Miss Ridley, asked Reverend Williams to visit a poor man living on Felsted Common. He agreed and went to the cottage on the common. As he was shown into the sick man's room, the man's wife said,
"Here is Mr. Williams come to see you."
The sick man started up, stretched out his arms, and exclaimed,
Are you come, sir? Are you the son of that blessed man? I shall never forget him.
How so? Why do you remember my father?
Well, sir, many years ago I was a little boy in Bocking Sunday School. One Sunday afternoon, your father came and gave an address to the scholars. I especially remember that he spoke to us little children in the gallery. He taught us a prayer and made us repeat it twice after him, to be sure we knew it. The prayer was, O Lord, convert my soul, for Jesus' sake. I repeated that prayer morning and night, just as he asked. It made me thoughtful and eventually led to my conversion. I shall never forget him, that blessed man.
The great day will likely reveal many similar instances of the saving good accomplished through John Williams's missionary speeches. One outcome of his successful meetings was the publication of his delightful book, Missionary Enterprises in the South Seas. As interesting as Robinson Crusoe, it was filled with the fervour of his beautiful spirit. Dr. Campbell said of it,
"One Williams does more to confound infidelity than 1,000 Paleys. One chapter of Missionary Enterprises in the South Seas is worth more for conviction than the whole mass of Lardner's ponderous volumes."
The book was dedicated, by permission, to King William IV, and within 5 years, 38,000 copies had been sold. In one richly bound copy, prepared for his wife, Mr. Williams wrote,
"My dearest Mary, more than 20 eventful years have rolled away since we were united in the closest and dearest earthly bonds, during which time we have circumnavigated the globe. We have experienced many trials and privations, while we have been honoured to communicate the best of blessings to multitudes of our fellow creatures. I present this faithful record of our mutual labours and successes as a testimony of my unabated affection, and I sincerely pray that, if we are spared 20 years longer, the retrospect may afford equal, if not greater, cause for grateful satisfaction. John Williams, July 1837.
He then appealed to the Christian public for a ship, and soon contributions reached £2,400. On March 15, 1838, he appeared before the Common Council of the City of London and pleaded for their help on behalf of the South Seas Mission. The council granted him £500, and with other donations, the total amount collected reached £4,000. Of this, £2,600 was used to purchase and equip a vessel called the Camden. The remaining funds supported the establishment of a Polynesian college and other missionary endeavours. The repairs of the Camden cost £400, but the shipbuilder contributed this as his gift to the mission. A supplier of fresh filtered water sent 20 tons to the Camden as a donation, and the pilot, whose fee typically ranged from £20 to £25, took the missionary ship down the river free of charge. On Wednesday, April 4th, 1838, a public meeting was held at the Tabernacle near City Road, London, to bid Mr. Williams farewell as he returned to the South Seas on the Camden. Though the meeting was scheduled for 6 o'clock, people began gathering 3 hours earlier, and many were unable to get in. Dr. Campbell, on behalf of the church at the Tabernacle, presented Mrs. Williams with 6 volumes of Scott's commentary on the Holy Scriptures, bound in Russia gilt, and a hymn book. To Mr. Williams, they presented a 20-volume encyclopedia. The highlight of the meeting, however, was Mr. Williams' own speech, which, in light of his tragic death, is particularly significant for its insight into his character and mission. Though too lengthy to include in full, a few excerpts will illustrate its nature. Mr. Williams said,
"I still feel that the work of Christian missions is the greatest, noblest, and sublimest to which the energies of the human mind can be devoted. I believe, Christian friends, that no labour we can bestow, no sacrifice we can make, no journey we can undertake, is too great for the glorious purpose of illuminating the dark world with the light of the glorious gospel of the blessed God. To my mind, There is something transcendently sublime in the comprehensive nature of Christian missions. I believe that Scripture statements are confirmed in a most striking manner. Scripture predictions are beautifully illustrated, and Scripture promises have been remarkably fulfilled by facts connected with the mission of which I now speak.
After alluding to the cost of the vessel, he continued,
If we were to go into the matter of mere expense, we could show that this would be the most economical method that could be adopted. However, when we contemplate engaging in any undertaking for the cause of our God, a trifling matter of expense ought never to stand in the way.
In reference to the subject of his preaching, he said,
We feel that we have something worth carrying. We have the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have the great truth that Jesus Christ came into the world to save sinners. We have the great doctrine of the atonement to carry. We believe it, and therefore we go around the world to tell it. The great story we have to tell is, God so loved the world, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. My dear friends, the very first sermon I preached in the native tongue was from this text. This is a faithful saying, and worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners. When I meditate on the wondrous scheme of human redemption, it appears to me that the great doctrine of the atonement is the most powerful and wonderful of all doctrines in all the creeds of the human race. In comparison with the great truth of salvation by the death of Jesus Christ, the universe itself appears a bauble. I love the doctrine, and I determine never to preach a sermon in any language where the great doctrine of salvation through the blood of Christ is not the sum and substance of the sermon. We think this is a truth worth carrying around the world. It is the soul of religious effort.
In conclusion, Mr. Williams said,
Whatever infirmities may attend me, I do feel this, that my integrity will I hold fast. I have but one object in view, and that is to carry the knowledge of Jesus Christ to those who are perishing for lack of that knowledge. This is my sole, my simple object. I can confidently unite with you in supplicating that God's blessing may rest upon us. I cannot do better than conclude with a prayer of one of the natives on the day we embarked from his island. O Lord, tell the winds about them, that they may not blow fiercely upon them. Command the ocean concerning them, that it may not swallow them up. Conduct them safely to a far distant country, and give them a happy meeting with long-lost relatives, and bring them back again to us. But if we should never meet again around the throne of grace below, may we all meet around the throne of God above. Amen and amen.
In his parting published address to the British churches, Mr. Williams said,
Great, of course, are the perils that await me. I may not again come back to repose at the first sight of the lofty cliffs and lovely plains of old England. Well, the will of the Lord be done. I shall be entombed in the ocean, or sleep in a foreign land, in the isles of the south, in the field of my labours, and among the graves of my children. Time alone can reveal the will of heaven. I would wait that revelation in the spirit of holy submission, love, and obedience.
On Wednesday, the 11th of April, he embarked on board the Camden, which lay off Gravesend. A steamer had been chartered to convey the mission party from London Bridge to the Camden, and about 370 people joined the voyage. When off Erith, the company filed past Mr. Williams, who sat in the stern of the vessel to say their farewells. An eyewitness described the scene.
At that moment, Mr. Williams was a striking spectacle of real moral greatness. On his right sat a beloved weeping sister, and on his left a still more beloved weeping wife, whose case drew special sympathy from those who knew it. With a constitution apparently broken, health only imperfectly restored, and naturally far from high spirits, she was leaving behind her a darling child and a venerated mother whom it was unlikely she would ever see again. Under such circumstances, the veteran missionary appeared to great advantage. There he sat, with a countenance as placid and a heart as tranquil as those of the lovely little one on his knee. Throughout the morning, he appeared to be in a very solemn frame, but deeply thoughtful. He did not mix extensively with the multitude or engage in long conversations. One would have said, "That man sighs for solitude." He sat until the whole company had passed, offering a word, a wish, or a request suited for everyone.
Mr. Williams left his son Samuel in England, and on the morning of his embarkation, he wrote the following letter in his son's album. The book was passed from hand to hand among the company on the steamer, and many on board copied the letter. As a display of his affectionate concern, it is fitting to include it here.
My dear and much-loved Samuel, you wish me to write a few lines in your album, and I comply with your dear wish on the morning of our embarkation for the far-distant isles of the Pacific, where your dear mother and I are again going to spread the knowledge of a precious Saviour, whom we wish you to love more fervently and serve more faithfully than we have done. We both unite in assuring you, my dear, dear boy, that Jesus is the most affectionate friend and the best of all masters. The caresses of a dear, doting mother, and the counsel and instruction of a tender-hearted father will avail you nothing without the friendship of Jesus Christ. We love him ourselves, and the united wish of your dear mother and myself is that you may love him too. We feel very keenly the pang of separation. We love our country, we love our affectionate relatives, and we love, with an intensity of feeling which only parents know, our dear, very dear Samuel. Why then do we go? We go because Jesus Christ has said, "He that loveth father or mother, sister or brother, wife or children, or lands more than me, is not worthy of me." We shall pray for you, my dear boy, every day of our lives, and trust, in answer to these prayers, that God, by his grace, will take possession of your young and tender heart. Then, when we return to England, which we hope to do in a few years, we shall find our beloved boy not only an intelligent and amiable, but also a pious and devoted youth, enjoying the good opinion and affection of all who know you, and living in the fear of God. This, my very dear boy, will enhance the pleasure of meeting beyond the power of description. But, my dear, dear son, you must pray for yourself, and you have God's own promise for encouragement. When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up. We have forsaken you, my dear boy, under very peculiar circumstances. It is for the cause of God that we have made this sacrifice. Plead this with God when you pray, and beseech him to be a father to you. The Lord bless thee, my dear boy, and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee. The Lord be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee, and give thee peace. These are the wishes and fervent prayers of your affectionate father, John Williams. 11th April, 1838.
Mr. Williams' son felt the separation deeply and could not be comforted for some time, but eventually he regained his composure and helped to cheer his father. From the deck of the Camden, Mr. Williams called out,
"Where is Sam?"
A friend held him up, and Sam clapped his hands in response.
Goodbye, Father.
After a brief farewell service aboard the steamer, the missionaries boarded the Camden. The steamer accompanied her for about 9 or 10 miles down the river. Before they parted, Mr. Williams called out, referring to the Camden,
"Isn't she a beauty?"
At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the vessels parted company, and the Camden continued down the river, followed by the ringing cheers of friends. Chapter 8. A Stephen with Many a Paul, 1838 to 1839.
One presses on and welcomes death. One calmly yields his willing breath, nor slow nor hurrying, but in faith content to die or live. Jesus, do thou my soul receive. Jesus, do thou my foes forgive. He who would learn this prayer must live under the Holy Cross.
The following is from an unpublished letter written by Pastor Besser.
The blood of the martyr of Erromanga is giving its loud sound into all regions of the earth, and preaching sermons which by their holy strength make the Lord Jesus divide the spoil with the strong. That ever was the earnest expectation and hope of this servant of God. It is gloriously done.
On the 19th of April, 1838, at 6 p.m, Mr. Williams looked for the last time upon the white cliffs of England. After the anguish of parting and the pangs of seasickness had abated, the mission party settled down to prepare for their future work. Besides Mr. and Mrs. Williams and their eldest son and his wife, the Camden carried 16 new missionaries, all destined for the South Sea Islands. These 20, along with Captain Morgan, commander of the Camden, and some of the crew, formed themselves into a Christian church, which numbered 26 persons, and celebrated the sacred ordinances of their faith. From 10 o'clock until 2 every morning, the younger missionaries gathered for instruction in the Tahitian and Rarotongan languages. The voyage passed without incident, and in September the Camden entered Sydney Harbour. From there, they proceeded to Samoa, where Mr. Williams chose Whazatutai, on the island of Upolu, as his future station. He had originally intended to make his home in Rarotonga, but Mrs. Williams preferred Samoa, and her husband deemed it wise to select Upolu, a district recently conquered and devastated by the war following the murder of Tamafainga. They had scarcely settled into their new home when a sorrowful event cast a shadow over the entire mission band. The Reverend J. Bamden, one of the new missionaries, drowned while bathing.
"I perhaps shall be the next,"
said Mr. Williams with almost prophetic foresight, for so it proved to be. On the 17th of January, 1839, Mr. Williams left Samoa for a visit to Rarotonga, arriving on the island on the 4th of February. His meeting with King Makea was filled with warmth and affection from both sides.
"Oh, Makea, how kind are God's dealings with us in sparing us thus far and permitting us to meet again."
Within a few months, the friends met where there is no parting, for the former things had passed away. On the 19th of the following October, Makea joined the great majority, and Mr. Williams would soon follow him. With a deepening earnestness and a softened character, which we now see as preparation for the great change, though we rarely realise it until our friends are gone, Mr. Williams worked to make the most of his life as it neared the end of its earthly mission. He distributed 5,000 testaments in the Rarotongan language and, just as importantly, began planning a college to train men to teach the scriptures. Mr. Buzzacott became the principal of this college. Mr. Williams gratefully observed the great improvement among the people. Socially and religiously, they were no longer the same as those who had once treated the first teachers with such shocking cruelty. This transformation was not quick, but it was lasting, the kind of success that encourages and sustains further progress. In all Christian work, much good service remains hidden, like heat applied to ice. Just as heat melts ice slowly at first, Christian work may not show immediate results, but as more heat is added, the ice not only melts but warms the water, bringing it to a boil. In the same way, steady, faithful work in God's service may at first seem to achieve little, but it is actually building momentum for deeper and more visible change. From Rarotonga, Mr. Williams travelled to other islands. On Atiu, he narrowly escaped drowning for the 7th time, this being the second such incident at the same spot. On the 2nd of May, he returned home, and except for 2 short trips in Samoa, he remained there until his final and fateful voyage. On the evening before his departure from Samoa for what would be his last sacrifice for the salvation of the South Sea Islanders, Mr. Williams visited Mr. Mills, a fellow missionary. The 2 friends sat for some time in solemn conversation, with Mr. Williams sharing his plans and hopes regarding what he sensed would be a dangerous mission. Their conversation was interrupted by the entrance of a blind chief named Sepetiah, who had recently converted to Christianity. Sepetiah, who had once been an idolater himself, expressed a strong desire to assist his beloved minister in reaching the heathen of the New Hebrides.
Teacher Williams, I am a blind man, but I have a great desire to go with you to the dark lands. Perhaps my blindness will make them pity me, and they will not kill me. And while I can speak to them and tell them about Jesus, my boy,
and he placed his hand on the head of his son, a bright young man,
can read and write, and so we can teach them many things.
Mr. Mills said,
I never saw Mr. Williams more deeply affected than he was by the earnestness with which poor blind Sepetiah pleaded for permission to follow him.
The blind man, of course, was not permitted to accompany Mr. Williams on his voyage, but without a doubt his willing heart was accepted by God, as if he had actually travelled to Eromanga. It is also remarkable that at the very time Mr. Williams was feeling sorrowful about what he instinctively sensed would be the end of his journey, such a source of encouragement was given to him. This must have provided him with food for devout reflection and strengthened him for the task he feared. No personal concerns held back this modern Paul. He resolutely prepared for what he knew would be his martyrdom. On the 3rd of November, 1839, Mr. Williams preached for the last time, choosing as his text Acts 20, verses 36 to 38, and they all wept profusely and fell on Paul's neck and kissed him, sorrowing most of all for the words which he spake, that they should see his face no more. Both preacher and congregation were deeply moved. Everyone seemed instinctively to sense the finality of the coming parting. At midnight that same evening, Mr. Williams bade farewell to his wife and children and went aboard the Camden. Mrs. Williams, in parting with her husband, earnestly pleaded with him not to land at Eromanga. Was it some inner warning conveyed to her spirit, or merely the foresight of affectionate concern? None can say. Before morning, the Camden had departed from Samoa, beginning the voyage that would lead to Mr. Williams's martyrdom. After a run of 600 miles, the Camden reached Rovuma on the 12th of November.
We soon discovered from the indentures on the coast,
said Mr. Cunningham,
that the island is shaped in a way that offers excellent shelter for vessels needing a harbour. After we had landed, the people gathered around us, presenting a most unpleasant appearance. They were all smeared with a powder made from the turmeric root. However, we noticed that some of them had European cloth wrapped around their bodies. The men wore long hair, and the unmarried girls left locks of hair on each side and the back of their heads. The centre, from the forehead to the crown, was closely cut and decorated with lime and turmeric.
Next day, they proceeded to the New Hebrides. In a letter dated the 16th, Mr. Williams wrote,
Thus, my friend, we live in a dying world. The grand concern should be to live in a constant state of readiness. I find this a difficult task, given the relentless demands on my physical and mental energies. But I find great comfort in knowing that many of God's people pray for me, and also that all is spent in the best of all causes. Oh, how much depends upon the efforts of tomorrow. Will the savages receive us or not? Perhaps at this moment you or some other kind friend is wrestling with God on our behalf. I am filled with anxiety, but I desire to act with prudence and faithfulness in the attempt to bring the gospel to these benighted people and leave the outcome to God. The approaching week is to me the most important night of my life. The approaching week is to me the most important night of my life. The Bible offers divine teaching, saying, "The eyes of the blind will see clearly out of darkness, and the Holy Spirit will teach you all things." It speaks of pardon with God's assurance, "I am the one who wipes away your sins, and the blood of Jesus Christ cleanses from all sin." On the subject of temptation, the Bible promises, "God will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you can bear," adding, "Sin will not have power over you, and I have prayed for you that your faith will not fail."
On the next day, Sunday, November 17th, they sighted the island of Fortuna. The natives were seen gathering in groups and signalling for the Camden to approach. A boat was lowered, but after some time of rowing, the party was unable to land. A chief, distinguished from the others by his bracelets and tortoiseshell rings in his ears, came aboard. Eventually, they found a bay on the other side of the island where they could bring the Camden closer, and there they landed. The natives crowded around them, showing great friendliness, but no one was willing to accompany them to Tanna. 2 young men came on board for a short time, but soon grew tired of the ship's motion and asked to return to shore. That night, they lay anchored, intending to reach Tanna, about 40 miles away, the next morning. In the darkness, they were treated to a spectacular view of the volcano, which, as Mr. Cunningham described, was
blazing up from the centre of its crater, accompanied by dense clouds of smoke.
On the following morning, Mr. Williams made the last entry in his journal. The unfinished sentence with which it concludes is both poignant and significant. The paragraph reads,
"This is a memorable day, a day which will be transmitted to posterity, and the records of the events which have this day transpired will exert an influence long after those who have taken an active part in them have retired into the shades of oblivion, and the results of this day will be—"
To him, the results of that day were likely made known in the land of light. For us, they remain veiled in mystery, though we can clearly see how Mr. Williams' martyrdom has inspired and sustained the heroic spirit in missionary endeavours, both at home and abroad. When we reach the age of results, we will likely discover that one great source of blessing has flowed from the tragedy in the New Hebrides. Through the death of this Stephen, many a Paul has likely been called to work, to suffer, and to draw others into the apostolic succession of those who have hazarded their lives unto death for Christ's sake. On the evening of November 19th, the Camden anchored off Eromanga. Mr. Williams remarked that since Samoa was now well supplied with missionaries, he had almost decided to make his home on the island near them. However, the next morning, as they rowed towards shore, he mentioned to Captain Morgan that he had abandoned this idea. He thought, instead of leaving quickly and proceeding to Anotum, the most southerly of the islands. One of the mission party later recounted that on the evening of the 19th,
Mr. Williams spent a very restless night, unable to sleep, as he himself told us, thinking about his intended labours in the morning.
The following account of the tragic events of November 20th comes from the narratives of Captain Morgan and Mr. Cunningham, who were eyewitnesses.
This is a day full of the most distressing circumstances. The events of this fatal day will form a dark page in missionary history. We sailed along the southern side of the island and entered a fine, spacious bay exposed to the west. The shore appeared inviting, with a serene stillness resting over its dark, romantic rocks, and the distant mountains presented a most enchanting view. A tribe of natives had followed our ship along the coast, and now we saw them gathering among the rocks, apparently enjoying the sight of our vessel. The boat was lowered, and Captain Morgan, along with Mr. Williams, Mr. Harris, and Mr. Cunningham, all set off for the shore. The ship, catching a fine breeze, stood out to sea to work its way back upwind, staying as close as possible for when the boat needed to return. 1 or 2 circumstances gave us confidence. Upon reaching the shore, we managed to get a chief to fetch us a bucket of water. He returned in about half an hour. Some others brought us coconuts. We also noticed children playing along the beach, which we assumed would not occur if the natives harboured any malicious intentions. Messrs. Williams, Harris, and Cunningham accordingly left the boat and went ashore. They began walking along the beach, interacting with the local people. At one point, Mr. Williams sat down, and a few natives gathered around him. He gave them some fish hooks and small pieces of calico. Captain Morgan then came ashore and sat on a bank opposite the boat, which was anchored just off the beach. The party continued along the shore until they reached a stream running inland. Messrs. Williams and Cunningham stayed by the stream, while Mr. Harris ventured further, eventually disappearing into the bush where more natives were present. At this point, Messrs. Williams and Cunningham had also separated. Suddenly, a terrifying yell echoed from inland, and the natives were seen chasing Mr. Harris. Almost immediately, he was struck down with clubs and spears and fell into the water. The moment Mr. Cunningham saw this, he ran toward the boat, calling out to Mr. Williams to run as well. Run! But instead of fleeing right away, Mr. Williams stood for a moment, looking inland towards Mr. Harris.
Oh, Lord.
It wasn't until he heard the war shell being blown and the yell of war raised, a clear signal for hostilities, that he began to run. However, instead of running directly to the boat, Mr. Williams made a dash for the beach and fell into the water. At first, only one native chased him and struck him on the arm with a club. Mr. Williams then put his head down into the water. By this time, another native arrived, and both began beating him with their clubs. Soon after, a group of natives gathered and thrust several arrows into his body. His body was stripped, and the natives were seen wearing his clothes. We could see the water turning red with his blood. His body was dragged out of the water and left exposed on the sand, surrounded by his murderers, while even the children took up stones and threw them at his lifeless corpse. As the natives occupied themselves with the bodies of Messrs. Harris and Williams, a man pursued Mr. Cunningham. Fortunately, Mr. Cunningham managed to throw a stone at his pursuer, which allowed him to escape.
Captain Morgan also recounted that Mr. Williams had said to him,
Captain, you know we like to take possession of the land, and if we can only leave good impressions on the minds of the natives, we can come again and leave teachers. We must be content to do a little, Babel was not built in a day.
Those in the boat were helpless spectators of the tragedy. Though they tried to head the boat toward Mr. Williams, the natives began shooting arrows and throwing stones at them, forcing them to retreat to the brig. One of those who remained aboard the Camden described their return.
As the boat approached within the hail, we sensed something had gone wrong, but none of us could have imagined the horror of what had happened. As the boat drew alongside, hurried commands of "Get a towing line ready" and "All hands to make sail" filled us with dread and anxiety about the situation. Then, we heard the captain cry,
"We have lost Mr. Williams and Mr. Harris. They're dead. The natives have killed them."
No words can describe the overwhelming grief we felt at that moment. Nothing in our past experiences had prepared us for such anguish. We looked vacantly toward the shore, which now seemed infinitely gloomy. The more we thought about it, the deeper our grief and wonder. We could scarcely believe that our friend was gone, his presence no longer with us to inspire our labors.
A gun was fired from the Camden, but instead of frightening the natives, they quickly carried Mr. Williams' body into the bush. The native teachers aboard the ship were so panic-stricken by the events of the morning that they refused to land on any other island in the dangerous group. Captain Morgan, therefore, had no choice but to make sail for Sydney, which they reached on November 30th. The Governor of New South Wales sent a warship, the Favourite, to Eromanga to recover the remains of Mr. Williams. The Favourite left Sydney on February 1st and reached Eromanga on the 27th. The savages confessed to having eaten the bodies, but a few bones, including the skulls, were returned to the captain. With these remains aboard, the Favourite sailed to Samoa. At midnight on March 24th, Mrs. Williams learned that she was now a widow. The grief of the Samoan people was intense, and cries of "Alas, Williams! Alas, our father!" echoed from every side. The remains of the martyr were buried in Apia, Samoa, and a monument was erected in his honor. The inscription reads,
"Sacred to the memory of the Reverend John Williams, father of the Samoan and other missions, aged 43 years and 5 months, who was killed by the cruel natives of Eromanga on November 20th, 1839, while endeavoring to plant the gospel of peace on their shores."
However, Miss Gordon Cumming, in A Lady's Cruise in A French Man of War, notes that the bones interred in Apia were likely not those of John Williams. The natives of Eromanga, misunderstanding the foreign ship's intention, took random bones from a cave where they buried their own dead, believing the ship wanted to buy human remains. John Williams' actual skull is said to be buried beneath a palm tree on Eromanga. Near it was buried a small piece of red sealing wax, about 1.5 inches long, found in his pocket by the natives, who mistook it for a foreign idol. This relic was later disinterred and sent to his children. The melancholy tidings of Mr. Williams' death did not reach England until April 6, 1840. Mr. Pritchard, the English consul at Tahiti, wrote in a letter dated March 3, 1840, to a friend in Birmingham.
His death has made a deep impression on the minds of the natives. Many of them are wearing mourning for him. They say they cannot sleep at night for thinking of him, and frequently start in their sleep, imagining they see him. One woman came to me with $50 in her hand, asking to buy a portrait of Mr. Williams, so she might have it to look at now that he is gone. In this case, as in many others, foreigners were the first aggressors. A few years ago, several foreigners united chartered vessels and went with an armed force to take possession of part of the island Eromanga, building a fort to protect themselves while they cut the sandalwood belonging to the poor natives at their pleasure. This sandalwood is very valuable in the China market. After obtaining a considerable quantity, a disease broke out among them, killing many, and the others were forced to leave. Many natives were killed by them. I am not sure whether Mr. Williams knew this was the island where the sandalwood expedition had occurred, but there is no doubt that his death, and that of Mr. Harris, was a result of the cruel treatment the natives received from the foreigners who forced their way onto these shores. Mr. Harris was a very interesting young man who had come out at his own expense. He had planned to return to England to marry, and then return to labour at the Marquesas.
As an example of the outrages that drove the natives to desperation, consider the following incident.
3 vessels collecting sandalwood anchored off one of the islands in the New Hebrides group. The white men plundered the natives, helping themselves to yams and fruit without offering any compensation to the people who cultivated the land. Nearly 300 pigs were seized, and when the natives tried to resist, they were mercilessly shot. Not content with these actions, the sailors landed again and chased the natives into a large cave where they sought refuge. The sailors then pulled down houses, piled dry thatch and other materials at the cave's entrance, and set it on fire, suffocating the trapped natives.
It is no wonder that such atrocities were repaid with similar violence. Dr. Turner noted that, to his knowledge, no fewer than 320 men involved in the sandalwood trade perished in less than 9 years. In the year of Mr. Williams' death, a whaling ship sailed along the coast of an island near Eromanga, firing indiscriminately into villages as it passed. 2 missionaries were on that island, but fortunately, the natives did not kill them in retaliation for the cruelty of their countrymen. In 1842, Mrs. Williams returned to England. While passing Cape Horn, she wrote a farewell to the South Sea Islands, from which the following is taken.
Farewell, rolling ocean, on whose bosom we have been borne from island to island, honoured by carrying the glad tidings of the gospel of peace to the benighted inhabitants. Natives, you who have felt and known that the Lord is gracious, farewell. May you be kept from returning to those evils which you profess to have thrown away, and be faithful unto death, that you may receive a crown of life. Heathens, I weep for you while I say, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. My dear children, I trust I say farewell only for a season. If spared, I hope to welcome you in the land of your fathers.
Her eldest son, John, and his wife remained in Samoa, and the last paragraph was addressed to them. In 1845, Mrs. Williams settled in Islington and became a member of Union Chapel. For some years, she actively worked among the poor as a tract distributor and sick visitor. However, in the winter of 1849-50, the symptoms of a disease appeared, and by 1851, it proved fatal. On June 15, 1851, she rejoined her husband, bearing witness to her faith in Christ until the end.
I hope I am not deceiving myself. Dear Jesus, have mercy upon me. My trust is only in thee.
What a happy meeting you will have with your dear Mr. Williams in heaven, remarked a friend, to which Mrs. Williams immediately replied,
Oh yes, what a day that will be! What a blessed day!
Another friend, comforting Mrs. Williams, recited,
Jesus can make a dying bed feel soft as downy pillows are, while on his breast I lean my head and breathe my life out sweetly there.
Mrs. Williams repeatedly murmured,
Oh, I wish I could. I wish I could.
Dr. Allen, who witnessed her final days, remarked,
Her faith was clear and unfaltering to the end. More than once, as I knelt at her bedside, and an almost overwhelming sympathy led to expressions and petitions that only the strongest faith could accept, her earnest yet tremulous response assured me that she held fast to her confidence. I left her, marvelling at the mysterious power of the faith that enabled her to endure so patiently.
He continued with a reflection that echoed John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress.
So her children and friends returned to their place, for those who waited for Christiana had carried her out of their sight. So she went and entered in at the gate, with all the joy and ceremony that her husband Christian had experienced before her.
Dr. Campbell, in describing John Williams, noted,
The first thing that strikes us about his person is his great physical strength, which contributed significantly to his success in his unique field of missionary work. He was massive rather than muscular, strong without being particularly active. His stature was slightly above average, with a broad chest and strongly set shoulders. His appearance was somewhat unusual, and he was often mistaken for a foreigner. There was something distinctly remarkable about Mr. Williams's presence. Once seen, he was easily recognized, even in a crowd of thousands. His head was large and long, lacking the conical elevation often associated with extreme benevolence, though he was known for that very quality. His forehead was an oblong square, not particularly broad, and it sloped back considerably. His face radiated uncommon kindness, with the serenity of a peaceful summer evening tinged with a slight sadness. His soft, lustrous eyes sparkled beneath dark brows, reflecting the inner benevolence that defined him. Every feature conveyed simplicity, peace, and integrity. His entire visage was so deeply stamped with good nature and goodwill that it inspired immediate trust in all who saw him.
Campbell further described Mr. Williams' work ethic.
He placed all his hope in labour under divine guidance. Without it, nothing was possible. He thrived in industriousness, unable to be idle, yet never in a rush. Even in an emergency, like escaping from a sinking ship or a burning house, he would have proceeded with calm deliberation.
He added,
Mr. Williams did not realise he was a genius until the people of England told him, and even then he wasn't sure. He believed that what he accomplished was achievable by anyone willing to put in the necessary effort.
Reverend W. Ellis, who knew Williams even more intimately, described his character.
He was richly endowed with rare qualities for the high and holy enterprise to which he devoted and ultimately sacrificed his life. Among his most notable traits were his practical abilities. The love that so many felt for him is undeniable. Evidence that benevolence and love ruled his heart, his natural and acquired abilities, his wide-ranging goals and actions, his ability to integrate himself completely with the people, making their advancement inseparable from his own happiness, and his unwavering focus on spreading the gospel and benefiting the people spiritually, made him one of the most honored messengers of mercy that the Church has ever sent forth, and that the heathen world has ever received.
In 1857, a Nova Scotian missionary and his wife settled on the island of Eromanga, where John Williams had been martyred. Initially, they were welcomed by the natives. However, when a measles epidemic broke out, the couple was blamed for causing it, and on May 20th, 1861, both were brutally murdered by the enraged islanders. In an act of near apostolic heroism, Mr. Gordon's brother immediately took up his slain brother's work, winning the affections of the very people who had taken both his brother and sister-in-law from him. Yet, on March 7th, 1872, he too received a martyr's crown, killed by a native whose child had died. Many have perished for Eromanga, but their blood was not shed in vain. The death of John Williams stands as a noble culmination of his lifelong service to the people of the South Seas. It was the highest and final expression of the sacrifice that had marked every year of his missionary career. Williams was fully aware of the dangers he faced each time he set foot on heathen shores, but his passion for souls was so fervent, his devotion so absolute, that no fear of peril could deter him. With the eagerness others reserve for the pursuit of gold, he craved the eternal salvation of the degraded tribes of Polynesia. His journal reflects this unrelenting zeal. It was a passion that consumed him throughout his life. He lived, planned, suffered, and ultimately died out of love for the souls of men. To such a man, the entire human race is deeply indebted. He elevated Christian morality through his unselfishness and sincere piety, inspiring others as if an angel shook his wings. Men like John Williams are among the greatest gifts of God's grace, living gospels that reveal what God can accomplish through a person who fully yields to his divine influence. Above all, such martyrdom places a lasting obligation upon Christians to continue the mission, ensuring that one day all nations will serve him, and all people will call him blessed. Galatians 1:24.
And they glorified God in me.
You have finished listening to John Williams, the Martyr Missionary of Polynesia. This audiobook was produced by scrollreader.com. Listen to more free audiobooks on our website, or order printed copies of these audiobooks. Finally, would you pray for the Lord to send labourers into his harvest? There are still islands today, as in John Williams' time, where people live who resist those who come with the message of salvation. Pray for the souls on North Sentinel Island, that they may be saved through the preaching of the gospel.